Good morning. So on behalf of the organising committee, Professor Liv Helene Willumsen, Synnøve Fotland Eikevik, and Christelle Taraud, I would like to welcome you to the Steilneset Symposium on Femicide. My name is Maureen Rees. The hybrid symposium is being arranged by Varanger Museum in association with the Vardø Women's Network. Varanger Museum consists of 3 museums, sited in Kirkenes, Vadsø and Vardø, on the Varanger Fjord. Varanger Museum documents the multicultural history of Norway's northeastern border area. Each museum has its own specific area of responsibility. Among Vardø's is dissemination of the 17th century witchcraft trials at the Steilneset Memorial. Vardø Museum was established as a museum of natural history in 1894 and is the oldest museum in Finnmark. The museum was founded to undertake research into the Barents Sea fisheries and still contains a sizable natural history collection from these first years. This, of course, is of considerable relevance as we consider the challenges of global warming facing the planet. The Arctic is at present warming at 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet. However, today on International Women's Day, we are focusing on another issue of global importance, femicide. The Steilneset Memorial commemorates the victims of the witchcraft processes in Finnmark in the 17th century, in which 91 persons were executed, the great majority women. This tragic history is conveyed at Steilneset through a unique collaboration between Professor Liv Helene Willumsen and 2 of the most influential artists of recent times, the late Louise Bourgeois and the world-renowned architect Peter Zumthor. I would now like to invite the chairman of the board of Varanger Museum, Gunn Bodil Mathiesen, to make her opening remarks.
My name is Gunn Bodil Mathiesen, and I'm recently selected to the chairman of the board of Varanger Museum, IKS. On behalf of Varanger Museum, I would like to say a few words about today. I was born in southern Varanger in the 70s, where Sami language was gagged by the authorities in Norway. But I also have a Sami background. When I grew up, I was ashamed to speak Sami, and everyone was, so I never learned it. The war in Ukraine probably shows one of abused people and innocent people. There are now millions of people on the run, especially women and children. We judge the war the strongest terms, and our thoughts today goes to all of they who suffers. The theme today, femicide, shows that this topic is not an end and something that only belongs to the history. This is happening today in all contents. It's highly relevant right now. Today we will have a few insights in the history of witch hunting and how this has been practiced in different cultures and continents through the ages. I know this area quite well because my father was born in a small rowing boat between Vardø and Kiberg, right on this fjord. So I have been a lot on this island and around. The importance of having this symposium here in Vardø 400 years after the witch burning took place could not have been more correct. Witch hunt is still going on. We will have to fight today for that today. I really look forward to it. In our culture, witchcraft has been a part of daily life. It is practiced today. It is quite common to seek people that can stop blood, remove pain, remove warts, etc., etc., especially in the Sami culture. Today, they are called healers, not witches. Women are most often exposed to oppressions and violence in our society today, and this is unfortunately still a shameful issue, where especially the Sami woman has been extra exposed. We all have a way to go when it comes to the public gap. It should not be necessary to have such a day as today, March of 18. The importance of the day's program shows us that this must still be on agenda, and we need to be informed about the situations worldwide. This scarf I'm wearing today is from a great-grandmother. It was given to my mother as a tradition that child who is born in our family of Sami women should be strong children and have good health and long lives. I am proud to wear this scarf today, but my mother, who got it when she was a little girl, she could not speak Norwegian and she did not understand it when she started in school in Tana in 1956, where everyone was learning Norwegian and Sami culture and the language who was begagged, so she wouldn't wear it. But now I am. I believe that we must mark 8th March and we must not forget and continue the work for women's rights. I wish you all a great day, and I really look forward to learning more about which persecutions and the positions of Sami women in society today. Good luck and thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like now to invite the mayor of Vardø, Ørjan Jensen, to say some remarks and to make the official opening of the Steilneset Symposium. Ørjan.
Thank you. Congratulations on the Women's Day, everybody. It's a big day for everybody, both men and women. And as I was in Vadsø earlier today, I heard the news. And 4 out of 5 men thought it was full equality in Norway, but only 2 out of 5 women thought the same. So apparently we have a long way to go to get full equality, and I'm looking forward to the speeches here today, and I'm looking forward to the arrangement in the evening where we are going to have more about the Women's Day. It's also noted that service is like everybody, both men and women, is harassed in the internet. But the service shows that men is harassed because of their opinions, and like a harassment which goes for their meaning and their opinions. But women are harassed for their bodies, their sexuality, and how they look. So the harassment is different from men to women, and this is a big issue also when we speak about engaging women into politics, into business and everything. So I'm looking forward to all these speeches. Dear visitors, dear speakers, and dear participants here today, both here in the hall and also on the internet, dear organizers and dear everybody. Welcome to the Steilneset Symposium on Femicide. It's a symposium that will discuss the persecution of women in the past and also in the present. It's a symposium on hate crimes against women. Like has been said earlier, the symposium is arranged by the Varanger Museum and the department here in Vardø. And I have to say I really appreciate that the Varanger Museum is arranging this symposium. It's an important topic, and I'm really happy also that it's arranged today on the International Women's Day. The symposium has internationally renowned researchers. Several of them has local roots and strong local connection. And also I have to mention that, of course, the corona has made this planning of the symposium challenging. Which one is able to come here? What kind of event is it possible to arrange? What kind of rules is it going to be regarding infection control? And now also with this cruel war in Ukraine. So I'm really impressed that you managed to get this event going. I'm really happy for it. Despite these challenges, you have managed to put together a really good program, and I'm really looking forward to it. Femicide, as I understand it, is understood as extreme violence and also murder of women, solely because they are women. This can be happening in a lot of different cases, of course, but a lot of times in connection with women wanting to leave a violent partner, or that they are in a violent relationship. It's also, like I mentioned earlier, about hate crimes against women in the form of harassment, also in the internet. It's often violent attempts of keeping women within the norm of a society, with a set of rules that is in this society, and can be for cultural and for religious reasons. And I have to say that no system, no tradition, or no culture can justify violations of women's rights, especially the right to live freely and the right to not be subjected to violence. So therefore I think a symposium like this is really important, and I'm happy this symposium is taking place. And also I have to mention a few words about the Steilneset Memorial. I think the Steilneset Memorial is a strong backdrop and a worthy setting around a symposium on femicide. Steilneset is the memorial site for the people who were killed in the trials more than 400 years ago. And like today, this was a dark period in Europe's history. Steilneset was the old execution site in Vardø, and this memorial is located nearby these horrific executions. And I have to say to everybody who has not been there, the memorial is nice to visit in the summer, in the day with the midnight sun. But for me, the most special visit is in the winter, when it's cold and you're freezing and it's dark and the wind is blowing, and you get this really, you get to know how these women would have felt 400 years ago. So for everybody, also try to visit the memorial in the night when it's dark and you can see these beautiful lights in the windows in memories of all these people. The memorial is a strong communication of this painful history, and it's a gripping feeling of the stories of this abused. And I always appreciate listening to Liv Helene when she speaks about this, and I'm really looking forward to your speech also today. It's really interesting to hear, and also as a person interested in history. Even if it's a sad and cruel history, it's really gripping to listen to these stories. So I think that the memorial in Steilneset, together with this symposium, has a strong relevance to the current issues and the current challenges in our society today regarding femicide and issues relating to women. During this day, we will have a lot of interesting speeches with different starting points, with different angles, and with different themes, and from different regions of the world. But all the lectures has a in-depth knowledge of the different issues around this topic, femicide. So I'm happy to be allowed to be participating here with you today, and I'm sure that we will have a lot of interesting lectures during the symposium. And with those words, I wish you all an interesting day. I hope you all also can attend the arrangement in the evening regarding the International Women's Day. And with this word, I declare the Steilneset Symposium on femicide for open. Thank you.
Thank you, Rune. The Steilneset Symposium is very grateful for the support given by the French Cultural Centre in Oslo, and we are delighted that the French ambassador to Norway, Pierre-Mathieu Duhamel, has recorded a short video presentation for the symposium.
Dear colleagues, dear contributors, dear friends, as soon as the French embassy in Norway learned about the conference held today in Vardø, it came as an evidence that we would support it as much as we could. First, because of the subject addressed, violence against women, a scourge that without a doubt demands to be tackled urgently, not only in France or in Norway, but worldwide. Then, because of the highly symbolic location of Vardø, with its Steilneset memorial, where in the 17th century, 91 people, including 77 women, were burned for witchcraft. Witchcraft relies on belief, and the horrendous trials those women had to go through speaks volumes about how irrationality and fear can infiltrate society. Since then, witchcraft has become the object of a specific in-depth study that illustrates the fate of women throughout history, and researchers have been tirelessly trying to give back to women their rightful place in society. The crucial and comprehensive work of Mrs. Christelle Taraud on violence against women throughout the world challenges us and raises our awareness. Her book, Feminicide, Une histoire mondiale, soon to be published, leaves no doubt about the phenomenon that will be exposed during this conference in Vardø. This calamity has no border, as it's unfortunately too often found in our democracies that we like to call advanced. This violence is also not confined to a particular part of society and has spread at a disconcerting pace in all social strata. 1 in 3 women in the world has been a victim of domestic violence, and unfortunately, we are saddened to verify each year that this number does not decrease, including in France. It is obvious today that despite the efforts made to stop the pace, violence is not contained and is still unleashed with intensity. Measures such as the emergency call numbers, crisis units, better training of police officers, public awareness campaigns, and repressive laws are unfortunately not enough. It is necessary to understand this plague in a more global way, to learn from our neighboring countries, even sometimes to copy their practices, that we will grasp and more easily fight the causes and the extent of the problem. With that spirit, I would like to greet the people behind this conference, which I am sure will open up new opportunities of research for us to continue this long fight towards gender equality. We have learned recently that today a virus can only be defeated globally through international cooperation and coordination. Feminicide also acts as a virus, and we will need to go beyond our cultural differences and our religious concepts to learn to fight it together and thoroughly. We must strive for more openness and sharing, more education and commonality, because through this fight against violence against women, pluralism and tolerance values that are essential for Norway and France are also at stake. The relevance of this conference leaves no room for doubt, and the choice of a highly symbolic place with the omniscient presence of Louise Bourgeois, a great defender of feminist causes, only reinforces the feeling of emancipation. I hope that the Vardø conference will be a beautiful and fruitful meeting, and that it will be part of a long cycle of study, exchange, and sharing. This is why I call on all contributors from all over the world to come exchange in Vardø every year on March the 8th. Let us work together towards the total eradication of the calamity that is violence against women and aim for a more feminine and feminist world. Long live the Vardø Conference.
Welcome back. Our keynote speaker today is Christelle Taraud. Christelle is a professor of history at the New York University in Paris, an associated member at the Center for the History of the 19th Century, and feminist. She wrote her doctoral thesis on prostitutes of the Maghreb area in North Africa and has extended her research to work on the migration of the first Europeans to the Maghreb, on the nature and conditions of their settlement, questioning their social relations of sex in the colonial Maghreb. Among her published works are Colonial Prostitution, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, 1830 to 1962, and Forbidden Love, Prostitution, Marginality, and Colonialism, Maghreb, 1830 to 1962. She is the editor of Feminicide, a world history, to be published later this year, and the reason that we're all here today. Christelle.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And thank you to be here. It's a tiny audience, but it's a very amazing audience, so it's great. So the question of today is, why a symposium on feminicide in Steilneset? And before going further in this inaugural presentation of today's symposium, I would like to say, first of all, my gratitude and my friendship to Liv Helene Willumsen, and to thank her very warmly for having taken very seriously this somewhat very crazy idea, launch a bit like a bottle in the sea, of having a very big meeting around the question of feminicides in this place and no others on this so important day for women, March 8. I would like also to thank Synnøve Fotland Eikevik and Marianna Muravyeva, the wonderful team of the Varanger Museum, for not only having listened to our idea immediately, but also for having allowed us to give it substance in this eminently symbolic place of violence against women, the Steilneset Memorial. And finally, I would like to thank the cultural services of the French Institute of Oslo and the House of Literature in Oslo too, in particular Marcelino Valiente and Madeleine Jedmes for making my visit possible. It's very impressive for a Parisian girl to be there at this time. A meeting, in the etymologic sense of the word, is always the product of numerous ramifications that act in arborescence, but also of work, passion, and conviction. The links have been built there without a doubt, will lead in the future to a fruitful and perennial collaboration of which we will speak again later when this moment, with its symbolic, historical, political, and human charge, will be over. There is, indeed, in this extraordinary convergence between the place, the Steilneset Memorial itself, and the qualification of the mass crime that was perpetrated there in the 17th century, the stakes where 77 women perish for the simple fact that they were women, something of a rare power that invites us to reflect with acuity, not only on the links between history and memory, but also on the way in which the violent heritages of the past resonate in our common today world, as will be shown precisely in the symposium program itself. When I was writing the first part of this terrible book, Femicide, A World History, the first part devoted to witch and as mass feminicide, it became very clear to me that the first place where this book should be discussed was the Steilneset Memorial. In its epistemological, historical, political, and ethical dimensions, the Steilneset Memorial embodied, for me, the very spirit of the book I was working on. I would like now to develop my argument in 4 short points, because I want to be so long. There is a very good and very impressive program, as you know. So my first point is from femicide to feminicide. From an epistemological point of view, as the great specialist in the question, Elisa von Jondenforge, points out in the fascinating article she wrote for Feminicide, A World History, femicide is a concept that developed in the United States during the second wave of feminism. It was the American writer Carol Orlock who first used it in 1974. It was then terrorized based on her experience during the International Tribunal on Crimes Against Women in 1976 in Brussels, who was attended 2,000 women from 40 countries. So it was then terrorized by feminist sociologist Diana E.H. Russell, who defined femicide as the murder of women by men because they are women. Diana E.H. Russell's use of the term femicide thus shed light, thanks to the use of a new neologism, on a specific type of very common violence, in the same time commonplace and trivialized. But for Diana Russell, the question is to identify very precisely a violence that not so such take place in, of course, society. So in using this new neologism, she yet identified as such, and for which the treatment was, by the fact, rarely insufficient, even non-existent crime. Codified in 2 edited volumes, Femicide, The Politics of Women Killing, and Femicide, in Global Perspective, respectively co-edited with Gilles Radford and Roberta Harms, the concept of femicide has transformed conventional perception of this type of crime, public awareness, scholarly research, and of course, policy making. This is largely due to the fact that the use of the term has focused attention of some of the specificity of female homicide, of both women and girls, including the unborn, in mass feticide, like in certain parts of Asia today. So the specificity of female homicide around the world, particularly in its close association with the domestic space. Thus, from a feminist perspective, femicide is interpreted in the context of patriarchal structures that distribute power very unequally between men and women, and in which men use a very polymorph violence to maintain women in a status of inferiority and subjugation. But what interests us here, beyond the definition established by Diana H. Russell in the 70s and 80s, is a translation that takes place between the concept of femicide, which focuses on understanding and analyzing female homicide as an individual and often domestic crime, and the concept of feminicide. This translation owes much to the work of Mexican feminist politician and anthropologist Marcela Lagarde y de los Rios, who transposed it to the context of the terrible murder of women that the city of Ciudad Juárez experienced for the early 19th. Inspired by the work of Diana Russell, she conceptualized the shift, both semantic and politics, from femicidio, the literal translation of femicide in Spanish, to feminicidio, feminicide in English. In doing so, Marcela Lagarde's goal was to illuminate the genocidal aspect of the phenomenon at work in Mexico, namely that women were destined to be destroyed by the very fact they belonged to a social group defined by gender, and that this targeting was part of a larger process of eradication aimed at the same group. As Marcela Lagarde noted in the first decade of the 21st century, femicide is one of the extreme forms of gender violence. It is I quote it, "It is a genocide against women and a state crime." A process that I believe can also be found at the heart of the witch hunt and the persecution of witches that Europe experiences in the 17th century, and that, for me, the Steilneset Memorial highlights perfectly. My second point is about a history of systemic violence against women. In the same way, the strength of the Steilneset Memorial is, in a general context that often aims between silencing and negating historical violence against women, to deny its systematic character, to document in a scientific manner. One, by mediatizing archival sources. That is very important, like in the Peter Center building. And of course, these archival sources was found by historians, and in this context by the wonderful work of Liv Helene, of course. So the first aspect is mediatizing archival sources and take sources very seriously. And the second one is relaying the academic word they have come out of them. And all of that is to illuminate the painful history of witch hunts that ravaged the north of Norway in the 17th century. For, and this is also true for the rest of Europe, even when this painful history have been the subject of historical works whose seriousness is indisputable, such as the remarkable ones produced by Silvia Federici, Armelle Le Bras-Chopard, Liv Helene Willumsen, and Raisa Maria Toivo, by whom we will have the great pleasure and fortune of being able to listen to this day. It is often an history relativized, especially in terms of statistics or in terms of the real nature of the crime. There is, indeed, a black number of the demographic reality of the witch hunt in Europe, knowing that an important part of them, how many, difficult to establish, was not judicialized and did not give rise to any archive exploitable by the historians of today. On the other hand, as shown by the work of great researchers, great scholars from the American continent, such as Marcela Lagarde, Rosalinda Fregoso, and Rita Laura Segato, the qualification of a crime, such as the one perpetrated in Ciudad Juárez, cannot be limited to a statistic question. The witch trial of the 17th century, religious and civilian alike, of which there are many traces, were, as we know, mainly aimed at women, who were the main victims. As Armelle Le Bras-Chopard points out in her article in Feminicide, A Global History, from the end of the 15th century to the 17th century throughout Europe, and as far as the Americas, the famous Salem witch trial in colonial Massachusetts, 18% of those convicted of witchcraft were women. My third point is about a policy of memory and history connected to the history of the present time. At the same time, the creation of the Steilneset Memorial, which has universal value for me, makes it possible to honor the memory of the victims by proposing in a harmonious wall a singular artistic, architectural, and historical synthesis. As Synnøve Fotland Eikevik rightly pointed out, the question of emotion was absolutely fundamental to the joint approach of Louise Bourgeois, Peter Zenter, and Liv Helene Willumsen when creating the memorial. And an emotion that literally seized me too when I discovered the place. A place where the voices of the missing women take their full place beyond the terrible confession obtained under torture, present of the wall of the memorial, confessions that led all these women to death, like indicated, sentenced to death, said the indictments. Of course, this horrible history linked to the worldwide omnipresence of aggression and violence against women, as the great specialist in the question, Marianna Muravyeva, will no doubt emphasize in her conclusion. The Steilneset Memorial is indeed, for me and for so much people in the world, one of the most impressive, suggestive, and emblematic memorial spaces in Europe. Here, in this precise place where 77 witches were burned, very contemporary situation concerning women today, some of whom belong to stigmatized and silenced minority, as Yaba Badoe will tell us, evoking the situation of women imprisoned in the witch camp in the north of Ghana, and Siri Brock Jensen, who will evoke the rampant misogyny suffered by Sami women in Norway in present day. So all the things can be enlightenment from a perspective that, far from the victimized patrimonialization of a marketing purpose of certain initiatives around the world, the Steilneset Memorial proposed a space of recollection that I define as ethical, put at the service of a document, non-profit, and appeased history. Also, witches are today fashionable. They can in no way ever be an object of commodification. To do so would be accept to kill them a second time by denying the mass persecution of which they were the victim as women. And my last point is about sorority and resistance. Because far from being only turned toward the past, the Steilneset Memorial is, for me, a bridge between the violence of yesterday and today, a complex and subtle way of confronting them, of looking them squarely in the face, with the claim objective of overcoming them, and why not, on this March 8, always a beacon of hope of eradicating them. One of the things that struck me when I first became interested in the Steilneset Memorial for Feminicide, a World History, was the fact that Norwegian institutions have taken a clear stand for the recognition of this crime like a state crime. This is why the presence of Queen Sonja of Norway at the inauguration was more than just symbolic. Thus, the symbolic power of the place, obviously incontestable, will confirming the reality of violence against women, remind us at the same time, and this is absolutely fundamental for me, that these women were not only passive victims, but also, in their own way, resistance, including in the context of paroxysmal violence and misogynistic arbitrariness such as witch hunts. It is the spirit of this resistance that inhabits, in my opinion, the unique place that is the Steilneset Memorial, and that is, at the end of this introduction and at the beginning of this day of reflection and memories, why it seems so important to me that this symposium be hosted here. So thank you very much. And now I give the word to Marianna Muravyeva for the presentation of the first session dedicated to the issue of witch hunt in the past. Thank you so much.
Our first speaker in this first session, Femicide in the Past, is Raisa Maria Toivo, who is Professor of History at Tampere University in Finland. She has published several works on witchcraft, particularly focusing on gender, notably Witchcraft and Gender in Early Modern Society from 2008. She is currently working on lived religion and experience in the Academy of Finland's Center of Excellence for the History of Experience. She is not here, she's hopefully in the digital space.
Because Liv specifically asked me to do that, and perhaps also to show you why and how Finland, despite it being an area where a comparatively huge number of witchcraft trials took place, both compared to most places in the rest of the Europe and to the population size in Finland at the time, nevertheless had no considerable witch hunt, and how demonology led to that fact. In 1666, the only continental style witch hunt of mass panic style that took place in Finland, then part of Sweden, started in the Åland Islands, halfway of the Gulf of Bothnia between Åbo and Stockholm. So that is relatively in southern Finland. At the time, it wasn't a remote place at all. It was rather central because it was between these capital places, Åbo, nowadays Turku, and Stockholm. There was one woman who offered to use her God-given supernatural skills to expose some thieves that had been causing harm in her neighborhood. So she came to the court herself and offered her help. The investigation, however, soon took a more sinister tone as the local judge, who was educated in German style and exposed to German witchcraft doctrines during his days, thought that such supernatural gifts were likely to require an open pact or an alliance with the devil. The accused woman confessed because that was quite often the case in Finnish witchcraft trials. People confessed quite freely because normally this didn't lead to very dire consequences. They just got monetary fines as their punishments, or sometimes not even that. And she thought that she really had the gift of exposing thieves. But unlike the normal cases, in this case, that woman was sentenced to be burned at the stake after decapitation. So she would be beheaded first and then burned on the stake. All capital sentences that were given in the Finnish lower courts or the Swedish lower courts were automatically reviewed by the Court of Appeal. Usually this resulted in leniency. Capital sentences for witchcraft were most often commuted to fines, birching, or at worst punishment, banishment. So exile from the neighborhood. This time, however, the Court of Appeal refused to grant clemency. Instead, the court ordered that the convicted woman should be carefully questioned about anyone else who had been party to her witchcraft, so that other sinners could also be brought before the court and sentenced in turn. This careful questioning, which the Court of Appeal ordered, apparently included, or at least was taken to include, permission to use torture. Torture is or was generally avoided in most of the court proceedings in 17th century Finland and Sweden, basically because everyone knew that it didn't produce reliable confessions. People would confess just anything under torture. But this time, the careful questioning was taken to mean that the lower court should use torture. So 7 other women were named and they were sentenced to death. Altogether, 13 women were indicted, incarcerated, and prosecuted, but for reasons that will become clear later, the rest of them were not convicted. They were freed. Now, to understand what was happening in Åland, it is necessary to spend some time on the context of witchcraft and witchcraft trials in the rest of Finland and in Europe in general. Now, estimates of the number of accused in witchcraft trials have come down from the once proposed 9 million to currently around 40,000 or 60,000, sometimes 80,000 accused in the whole of Europe during the period of the witch hunts, which is a relative term in itself. The witch hunts were often quite short periods of time, and between them, nothing happened in many places. Of these accused witches, it is usually said that roughly 2/3 were women, but it is equally difficult to generalize that. And there are places where even more of the accused witches were women, and there are also places where considerably smaller proportion of the accused people were witches, women. Finland is one of these places. It's generally thought that it was 49%, so little less than half of the accused people, accused witches were women. The proportion comes down if you start looking at the 18th century witchcraft trials or superstition trials, when most of the accused people were men. If you compare European numbers to Finnish numbers, it is immediate to Finland, which is the immediate context of our Åland trials. There were roughly about 2,000 trials, with half of the accused being men and another half women. As you can see, the differences in the number of trials and proportions of sexes in the witchcraft trials around Europe are vast and very sharp. And there are many reasons behind these differences. But one major factor was what was treated in courts as witchcraft, and then again, what historians have counted as witch trials. The two most important types of witchcraft to mention here were the traditional maleficium, or magical harm on your neighbors and their cattle, as the first type. These maleficous witches were both male and female, and they usually worked alone. So these trials practically never escalated into witch hunts or mass panics. And you can see that their proportion, the purple one in my chart here, is and remains the most dominant one. In the late 15th and early 16th century, new types of witchcraft began to spread, and learned demonologists began to propose new demonological theories, claiming that witches were in league with the devil and gathered together to worship him in the witches' Sabbath, or the Swedish Blåkulla, where they would do all sorts of harm together. And the Blåkulla gatherings provided a possibility of seeing other witches, accomplices, and making it possible to demand that these witches were named in the trials under torture, and that the once already accused witches would name accomplices, and thereby they would accumulate into a proper hunt instead of just an individual witchcraft trial. You can see in the chart that this proportion of the demonological witchcraft trials or Sabbath trials, which almost always had only women as their accused, is a very small one in the Finnish trials. And the Åland trials belong into this particular lot. So a rather small lot in comparison to other kinds of witch trials. In Åland, the first 5 interrogations went quite smoothly. The women confessed having a pact with the devil and being in the league. They generally said that they had met the devil, and he was dressed as a youngish sailor. That is an island version of the velvet-coated, dashing continental devil, the young sailor. And he had given them, they told, a special ointment or salve, which enabled them to fly to Blåkulla to the Sabbath, where they then paid him taxes, either in money or butter. That is a Finnish version of the marriage that was sealed with sex in Germany and German trials. So Finnish witches paid taxes in money or butter. And then the devil hit a mark on their shoulder or their side to mark them as his own, as his leaguers, as his allies. And the women even produced the ointment that they had received from the devil. You have here the picture by Alfred Dürer of a witch riding a goat to the witches' Sabbath. So the witches in Åland didn't have a goat. They just had the salve or the ointment which enabled them to fly. However, as the first 5 women were, after their confessions, sentenced to their deaths, the last of them withdrew her confession. She had never met the devil, she said, nor taken part in any parties for him, and the mark on her shoulder was only a bruise from where she had taken a fall in the cowshed. And as far as the ointment or the salve went, it was actually just a box of boot polish that the women had borrowed from the prison guard when they were threatened with torture. And the unhappy prison guard was forced to verify this. So from witches flying to the witches' Sabbath, they suddenly came down to stolen or borrowed boot polish. We have here the boots of Gustav II Adolf from his engagement portrait. I'm not sure. They look very polished, but it's definitely different polish. It is at this point during the trial that the judge who was judging the whole trial introduced the demonological authorities in his records. He is actually quite an unusual judge in that he actually refers to learned demonological treatises and other sort of guidebooks in his court records. Normally, the judges just refer to the law of the land, the rural Swedish law, but this one actually referred to books that he had read on witchcraft. And there is quite a lot of them, these books, actually. Most of them are sort of legal guidebooks on how to conduct a witch trial. But there is also demonological theoretical thought in them. The whole Blåkulla idea was something that came from these books, mainly by Ludwig Dunther. But this is the point where the judge begins to refer to the books himself. And it is clear that he is very worried because of the boot polish revelation. Could it be that the women in question were not actually witches who actually flew to the witches' Sabbath, but that they were deceived by the devil into thinking that they did? In which case they would still be working with the devil, but they wouldn't be as active and as evil as if they were doing it consciously, because they would just be deceived. Also, could he himself be deceived? The devil, who he was, after all, a master deceiver. So was it possible that the devil would deceive a good God-fearing judge to sentence wrongfully innocent people? He was a master deceiver. And so it is these worries that the judge in Åland was pondering when we find the references to demonology in his court records. The most important reference and the most frequently appearing reference was the one in the middle here, Gewissensaustragen von Prozessen wider die Hexen by Michel Freude, a German pastor who was involved in witchcraft cases at his home. But there's also references to Martin del Rio's Magicarum Libri and Friedrich Speer's Cautio Criminalis. And these are all works that have been used both in order to support witch hunts and in order to, especially Speer's Cautio Criminalis, in order to tone them down and advance skepticism. So it was on Freude's, Del Rio's and Speer's authority that the judge in Åland decided to perform a pricking test on the witch's mark to see if it was real or not. And eventually he quoted Del Rio writing that as long as a judge stayed uncorrupt and obedient to God, he would be protected against the devil's deception. It was on this authority that the fifth woman in Åland eventually was sentenced to death, even though she recanted her confession. It was, however, also on the same authority that the judge told the Court of Appeal to consider not so much if he might have been mistaken himself, but if there was a way to be lenient towards this woman, despite the fact that she was in league with the devil, clearly in league with the devil, and if there was a way to spare her life, since everything was so unclear and mistakes could be made after all. Not necessarily that he had made a mistake here, but because mistakes could be made. In his investigations of the 8 remaining and already indicted witches, the judge in Åland never convicted another one. So this was where he ended up with the help of demonology. So the Åland mass trials, which had 5 victims, had a reputation already when they were going on that they were bad and that they were insecure. And they ended not as a glorious tale of fighting against the frightening evil of the devil, but in a dose of general skepticism in the law's abilities to uncover truths and the judge's self-doubt. And now if we go to look at the statistics again, this may very well be that the doubt and the skepticism to uncover truths may very well be why demonological witchcraft theories never gained much popularity in Finland. So this rather embarrassing episode took place in the beginning of the demonological phase, but it also may be that it is why the demonological theory never got much foothold in Finland in general. The Sabbath narrative can be found from everywhere in Finland at the latter half of the 17th century, and there were a few Sabbath trials in the 3 following decades on the 17th century, but mostly they remained individual, without the snowballing of accusations from the witches' Sabbath. Many, though not all of them, ended up in acquittals, so the witches were deemed not guilty. Conviction rates remained low, and compared to the hunts in the rest of the Europe, the rates of death sentences were even lower, so it's less than 10% in all of the witch trials, and even those were often commuted by the Court of Appeal to fines and other smaller punishments, more lenient punishments. The same had always been true of maleficium and superstition trials. Death sentences were not legally required, and in most cases they could not even legally be given to these crimes. They were not possible. Consequently, the majority of witchcraft trials in Finland ended with either a sentence of monetary fines or a complete acquittal. Finland generally avoided what today would be called a witch hunt or any kind of side, witchicide or femicide or something like that. Now, let me be clear, there has been and still is harassment and even hate crime based on sex and gender in Finland. There is, for example, right now a big social media debate about a book where a very old lady in her 80s and 90s reveals that she was the victim of an attempted rape by a very famous actor-producer in the 80s. And people keep piling up on her because of this, condemning her because she didn't come up, didn't reveal this sooner. And saying that it probably wasn't even true. So there is hate crime based on sex and gender in Finland. It is evident both in everyday life and, of course, at times of crisis such as war. But in Finland, the witch hunt may not be the best point of comparison, because the fifth witch hunt never was properly lighted, if you pardon such an expression in this context. So it never got properly running. And that may also why one of the most prominent witch figures in today's Finland are these little children going around on Palm Sundays just before Easter, trading their colorful palm leaves and their blessings to the houses that they go to candy in an appropriation of the Eastern Orthodox custom, Easter custom of trading palm leaves and blessings to food. But they go around dressed as witches, also in an appropriation of perhaps the Halloween customs, but they're just moved to Easter. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Armelle Le Bras-Chopard, who is a professor emerita at the University of Versailles in Paris. Her research encompasses democracy, socialism, war, and society, with particular reference to gender issues within these subjects. Thank you.
Le gynécide des sorcières, ancêtre des féminicides d'aujourd'hui. De la fin du XVe siècle au XVIIe siècle, dans toute l'Europe et jusqu'aux Amériques, le fameux procès des sorcières de Salem, parmi les condamnés pour sorcellerie, il y a 80% de femmes et la proportion est même plus importante à Vardø. Le départ officiel de cette chasse aux sorcières peut être daté de la bulle du pape Innocent III de 1484. Mais il ne s'agit pas de n'importe quelle magicienne concote des potions ou qui jette des sorts. Il s'agit de sorcellerie démoniaque, celle de femmes qui obtiennent leur pouvoir maléfique grâce à leur commerce avec le diable. L'Inquisition, ce bel instrument qui a été créé pour juger les hérétiques, servira pour les sorcières, puisque les hérétiques ont été pratiquement éradiqués. Le phénomène est avant tout judiciaire, dans des procès menés conjointement par des ecclésiastiques, les inquisiteurs, et des magistrats laïcs qui, au fur et à mesure du temps, vont prendre de plus en plus de place et vont s'emparer de l'ensemble de la procédure. Il faut noter que la chasse aux sorcières n'est pas seulement le fait des catholiques, mais aussi des protestants après la Réforme, et c'est précisément le cas à Vardø. Ce n'est pas cette longue histoire de la sorcellerie que je retracerai ici. Mon propos est de montrer le lien entre le gynécide des sorcières et les féminicides d'aujourd'hui. Gynécide parce que ces femmes sont exécutées, non pour ce qu'elles auraient commis, mais parce qu'elles sont des femmes. À la façon dont, dans les génocides, des populations entières sont massacrées au nom de leur ethnie ou de leur religion. Je me suis référée au texte de ceux qu'on appelle les démonologues, ceux qui, à l'époque, ont écrit sur la sorcellerie. Théologiens, penseurs et surtout inquisiteurs ou magistrats qui ont relaté leurs propres procès, se vantant souvent d'avoir fait brûler plus de sorcières que leurs voisins d'une autre région. Il serait trop long de mentionner ici tous ces auteurs. Je les ai cités dans l'ouvrage collectif sur le féminicide, sous la direction de Christelle Taraud, qui doit paraître ces jours prochains. Parmi ces livres de démonologie, je dois toutefois évoquer deux de ceux-ci, car ils servent de référence systématique dans tous les procès. Le Malleus Maleficarum, le marteau des sorcières de 1486, écrit par les terribles inquisiteurs Institoris et Spranger, et de la démonomanie des sorciers du juriste Jean Bodin en 1580. Ce livre, à cause de ses thèses si invraisemblables sur les sorcières, est pudiquement oublié et seulement disponible en vieux français. Je m'attacherai aux deux principaux traits communs au gynécide et au féminicide. D'une part, ce sont les femmes qui sont visées. D'autre part, l'issue pour elles est une mort violente. La sorcellerie, un crime de femme. Dans les procès en sorcellerie, les juges, le bourreau, le médecin expert, le confesseur qui tente de soutirer les aveux, tous sont exclusivement des hommes et, comme pour les féminicides, c'est en grande majorité des femmes qui sont tuées. Les démonologues se sont interrogés. Pourquoi, dans ce sexe si faible, les femmes trouvent-on davantage de sorcières que parmi les hommes? C'est le titre d'un chapitre du Malleus Maleficarum. L'explication est à rechercher dans la nature de la femme. Et plus que de théologie, c'est le savoir médical en plein développement à l'époque qui sert de référence. La femme est imbécile au sens étymologique du terme. Imbécile vient du latin pecilus, bâton. C'est-à-dire que les femmes manquent de bâton, de sexe mâle. À sa place, la femme possède un organe, le plus souvent vide, l'utérus, dont s'échappent des vapeurs noires et malicieuses qui, par le chemin de l'épine dorsale, lui montent à la tête. La tête qui est le siège du raisonnement. La femme est donc folle, instable, versatile. En vertu des rapports entre le physique et le moral, son intelligence est aussi creuse que son utérus. Voilà pourquoi elle se laisse si facilement séduire par le diable. Et de même que son utérus est dissimulé à l'intérieur de son ventre, tandis que l'homme exhibe à l'extérieur ses organes sexuels, elle est hypocrite, sournoise, menteuse. Aussi, il faut se méfier des femmes qui sont trop dévotes, qui passent leur temps à l'église pour donner le change. Ce sont sûrement des sorcières. Mais le plus inquiétant, c'est que ces vents qui lui montent à la tête des femmes, les incitent à la lubricité. On le voit, disent les démonologues, à leurs multiples turpitudes. La femme est le signe de la concupiscence. Calvin craint, je cite, les appétits brûlants de la femme, une chienne chaude. La femme est folle de son corps, elle a, par nature, le diable au corps. Pour Luther, la sorcière est une putain du diable. Au sens propre, car la doctrine théologique admet désormais, à cette époque, que le diable, auparavant considéré comme un esprit, peut prendre une forme physique, homme, bouc, etc. Ce qui scelle le pacte avec Satan, c'est cette copulation avec lui, que personne n'a pu voir, mais les aveux des sorcières, extorquées sous la torture, suffisent à établir sa vérité. Et ces juges très austères se plaisent à reproduire ces aveux jusqu'aux descriptions très précises du sexe du diable. Pour les unes, il peut être très long et tortueux, ou bien il est fait d'écailles de fer qui se rebroussent quand le diable se retire du corps de la sorcière. Il est toujours précisé que les femmes, qui aiment le plaisir de la chair, en couchant avec le diable et devenant ainsi des sorcières, le font de leur plein gré. Elles ne sont pas violées. Sans ce consentement, elles ne pourraient pas être jugées. Toute femme est donc, par sa nature femelle, une sorcière potentielle. Après son pacte charnel avec Satan, elle obtient des pouvoirs de nuisance, faire tomber la grêle sur le champ du voisin, provoquer sa mort ou celle de sa vache, etc. Mais ce ne sont pas tant les dégâts qu'elle provoque et qui certes troublent l'ordre public qui forment l'essentiel de l'accusation. Ces dégâts apportent seulement la preuve concrète du pacte diabolique, mais il faut le répéter, le véritable crime, c'est la copulation avec le diable, crime de lèse-majesté divine. Aussi, contrairement à l'image stéréotypée de la sorcière, dans les contes d'enfants, les déguisements d'Halloween, la sorcière n'est pas forcément une vieille femme au nez crochu. Comme on le constate à la lecture des procès, ces femmes sont souvent jeunes et jolies. Le diable préfère la chair fraîche. Et loin d'être des marginales qui cueillent des herbes à l'orée du bois, elles sont bien intégrées dans leur communauté et même riches. Il est préférable d'ailleurs qu'elles soient riches, car les juges confisquent leurs biens à leur profit et invitent même à déjeuner le bourreau aux frais de la sorcière, tandis qu'elle achève de brûler sur le bûcher. Ces femmes, en fait complètement innocentes, tant des méfaits qu'on leur impute, que bien sûr de cette coucherie avec le diable, demandent parfois, naïvement, au juge, peut-on être sorcière sans le savoir? Rien d'étonnant dès lors, à cause de cette nature féminine pernicieuse, à ce que, je cite, parmi les sorciers, il y ait plus de femmes que d'hommes, écrivent donc les inquisiteurs du Malleus Maleficarum, et c'est pour cela, disent-ils, qu'on parle d'hérésie des sorcières et non des sorciers, car le nom se prend du plus important. Une mort exquise. Dans ces procès exclusivement à charge, la sorcière est promise à la mort dès son arrestation. Elle ne peut en effet annuler son pacte avec le diable, quand bien même elle le voudrait, et son repentir ne la sauverait pas. Il faut l'éliminer définitivement, non seulement pour la châtier de son crime, mais surtout pour éviter son prosélytisme. Elle recrute des femmes qu'elle emmène au sabbat et il faut se prémunir de l'infection contagieuse. Mais comme il ne faut pas laisser à des individus privés, des particuliers, le soin du châtiment, c'est souvent la lapidation de la population qui avait lieu et désormais c'est à la justice et aux autorités publiques d'œuvrer. C'est l'inquisition, non pas une procédure accusatoire, c'est-à-dire la nécessité d'une accusation pour enclencher un procès, mais comme son nom l'indique, inquisitoire, le juge peut se saisir directement de n'importe quelle affaire, sur dénonciation, simple rumeur ou de lui-même. Et cette procédure est dite extraordinaire, donc hors du droit commun. Car, explique Jean Bodin, je le cite, il est certain en termes de droit, où il y a péril et nécessité et choses exorbitantes, qu'il ne faut pas s'attarder aux règles du droit, mais au contraire, c'est droitement procéder selon l'ordre du droit, de laisser l'ordre du droit. Mais juridiquement, même dans ce droit qui s'est affranchi du droit ordinaire, l'aveu, la pulpe de vérité, est nécessaire pour passer à la condamnation. Il sera obtenu par la torture. Avant même la question, torture, ces femmes sont soumises à toutes sortes de brutalités. À peine arrivée à la prison, la sorcière est déshabillée pour voir si elle ne dissimule pas un talisman qui l'empêcherait d'avouer, le charme de taciturnité. On recherche aussi sur sa peau la marque du diable, c'est peut-être en fait n'importe quelle tache ou cicatrice. Si elle n'est pas visible, ces hommes piquent la sorcière pour la détecter cette marque, avec un poignard ou une grosse aiguille qui parfois se brise dans les chairs. Et ils la cherchent au plus près du lieu de la concupiscence, dans les parties honteuses. Le pubis est alors rasé ou ses poils sont brûlés avec une chandelle. Et c'est parfois l'occasion de violer la femme dénudée. Toutes sortes de méthodes cauteleuses, avouent les inquisiteurs, du Malleus Maleficarum, sont utilisées pour obtenir l'aveu. Et la plus sûre, c'est la torture. Elle a été interdite, mais néanmoins autorisée par le pape en 1252 pour, et seulement pour, les hérétiques. Pour la pratiquer, il y a un grand choix de méthodes et d'instruments. Brodequin, chevalet, empêchement de dormir, pendaison par les pieds, pointe de fer fichée sous les ongles, etc. La sorcière nie d'abord toute compromission avec Satan, mais elle finit par avouer, par dire ce que les juges veulent entendre et qu'ils lui ont soufflé. Elle peut enfin être mise à mort. En Angleterre, elle sera pendue. Sur le continent, c'est le bûcher qui prévaut. Certaines tentent de s'échapper des flammes. Le bourreau les rattrape, les assomme et les remet sur le brasier. Pour Jean Bodin, il ne faut pas s'exagérer la cruauté de cette crémation. Il ne faut pas, dit-il, plus d'une heure, voire 1h30, dit-il, pour que la sorcière meure. En définitive, c'est rapide. Le feu permet d'éliminer toute trace de la sorcière et les cris, l'horrible puanteur de la chair brûlée, sont une pédagogie de l'effroi destinée à dissuader celles qui seraient tentées d'entrer en sorcellerie. En conclusion, il est impossible dans cette brève présentation d'analyser les causes de cette chasse aux sorcières. D'une façon générale, il semble qu'il y ait eu une peur diffuse vis-à-vis des femmes, peur qui se répand du haut de la société jusqu'aux paysans. La peur d'une prise de pouvoir des femmes au plus haut niveau de l'État, reine, régente, jusqu'au plus humble foyer, et qui se trouve liée chez ces hommes à la hantise de perdre leur virilité. Ce dont témoignent les obsessions sexuelles des démonologues et leur crainte du maléfice du nœud de l'aiguillette qui est censé rendre impuissant. Entamée en Suisse ou à Vardø, la réhabilitation des sorcières a été votée par le Parlement de Catalogne dans une résolution toute récente, le 26 janvier dernier. Dans les commentaires de ce texte, le mot féminicide a été employé pour désigner ce que ce Parlement a nommé une persécution misogyne. Certes, il y a des différences entre le gynécide des sorcières et les féminicides. Le premier est le fait des autorités publiques, c'est une violence d'État, et frappe les femmes de façon massive, tandis que les seconds, les féminicides sont le fait d'individus, sont individuels, c'est une violence privée et qui est au contraire réprimée par la loi. Mais dans un cas gynécide comme dans l'autre féminicide, le résultat est le même. Ce sont des femmes innocentes qui en sont les victimes dans une mort précédée d'atroces brutalités. Je vous remercie. Thank you.
Our final speaker in the morning session is Liv Helene Willumsen, who is a professor emerita of history at the University of Troms in Norway. Liv Helene has published several books on witchcraft trials, particularly in Finnmark, Scotland and Northern Europe. Willumsen has published all primary sources of the Finnmark witch hunt in Norwegian and English. She has also written the exhibition text at Steilneset Memorial.
Thank you, Marianne. And first, congratulations with the Women's Day to all of you. It's very good to be part of this symposium. And I would like to thank those who have organized the symposium together with me, Marianne Rees, Synnøve Fotland Eikevik, and Christelle Taraud. And I would like to thank Christelle Taraud for coming from Paris up to Vardø to see Steilneset Memorial for the first time, which she did yesterday. This is very, very good to experience. Then I would like to thank for support the French Embassy. I would like to thank Vardø Municipality and the County of Troms and Finnmark for financial support and Fritt to this symposium. Today, on this special day, I will focus on women in witchcraft trials. I will say something about European ideas of witchcraft coming up to Finnmark, facts about the trials, and take a closer look at 4 trials of women accused here in Vardø. And finally, a few words about Steilneset Memorial's symbolic impact. Witchcraft persecution in Europe came from south to the north. The period of European witchcraft trials were 1450 to 1750. And we had early trials in Catholic Switzerland and Germany. And the period of witchcraft persecution in the north of Europe was late 1500s and 1600s. In north of Europe, Scotland was the country with the most intensive persecution, and Finnmark likewise the district. For the whole country of Norway, there was the period 1560 to 1695, that was the period of persecution, 750 persons accused, and 310 death sentences in fire at the stake. 80% were women, and this is also the European average. Trials took place in all parts of Norway, and new and learned European witchcraft ideas affecting women in special influenced the trials, particularly in Finnmark. We see two concepts of witchcraft in these trials. First, there is the old traditional witchcraft, maleficium, with inherent power and individual performance. This is the old-fashioned type of understanding of witchcraft, where one person who was supposed to perform witchcraft could throw witchcraft on a human being or an animal, causing sickness or death. Then came up the new learned doctrine, Demonology, centered of ideas with hatred against women, and it started in the Council of Basel in the 1430s and developed into a construction of a dangerous female figure, the demonic witch, based on pact with the devil, power from the devil, worshipping the devil at Sabbaths, and collective performance. There were many together performing witchcraft. And these ideas spread in books throughout Europe. And here you see the title page of one of the most famous demonological works, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Witch's Hammer, from 1486. These ideas came also to Finnmark, to Vardø and Vadsø and the neighboring villages. And we know about these trials because the court records, the records written during trials, are well prepared, and it is in the regional state archives of Tromsø, and these were written in the Gothic hand. You can see 2 pages here. Is beautifully written by a scribe. The Finnmark trials took place in the 1600s entirely. 3,000 inhabitants in Finnmark at the time, 135 persons accused, of these 82% women. There was a high rate of execution, 67%, and 91 persons lost their lives. 77 women, which makes 84%. Other sentences were banishments and fines. The demonological ideas about witches' Sabbaths or gatherings developed into witchcraft panics, which were a large number of successive witchcraft trials during a concentrated period of time. And here you see in Finnmark the trials, and you note 3 tall columns. And these are witchcraft panics. These came into being in this way. A woman was accused of witchcraft, then imprisoned, and interrogated under pressure. She confessed to the devil's pact and to witches' gatherings. And always the next question came after the confession of the witches' gathering. Who else did you see there? So new names came up, new people into the courtroom, and new trials. There were 2 groups of ethnic groups of people in Finnmark at the time, living side by side, the Norwegians and the Samis. And Norwegian women were in majority among those accused. You see the red color here, and you see this concentration in the middle of the 17th century. Sami women were also accused. Those are in red color, both in witchcraft panics and in smaller clusters of groups of trials and in single trials. So who were these accused women? They were ordinary women living their lives in Finnmark, particularly in the east. They were women walking on the roads here in Vardø. All women could be accused, and it was dangerous to be a woman at this time in Finnmark. They were not particularly old, 68% married, 20% maids, and these young women, several of them came traveling north to Finnmark from south along the coast of Norway, further south. So how did this idea reach up to Finnmark, these European ideas? Partly by the letters of the law. There was a witchcraft decree in 1617, read at the local courts in Finnmark in 1620, and this decree states that the real witch is the one who has entered into a pact with the devil. So a clear demonological idea is taken into the laws. Then there is the personal factor, the governors. Scotsman John Cunningham, installed in Finnmark 1619, Jørgen Friis, 1651, Christopher Orning, 1661, and after these installations, we have the witchcraft panics. We have king, courts, and judicial officials. Vardøhus fortress was the administrative center of Finnmark, and here the king's man lived. The mental luggage of mighty men with power to start and continue trials is very important. And at the right you see this watercolor. It is of Vardø Island, and you see Vardøhus fortress at the time marked, and it is made by Hans H. Liljenskjold, who was a governor in Finnmark late 1600s. There were two main demonological ideas we can see in the court records. First, the devil's pact. It's a narrative. The devil is tempting, comes several times, giving promises. The woman gives in and renounces her baptism and enters a new pact, receiving evil power. A very dangerous confession. Then there is the idea of witches' Sabbath or gathering. And you can see here one artist. He is painting like it was a trial with an accused and even a scribe. But if you look at the sky, you see strange figures and there are skulls on the floor. So, demonology shows strong contempt of women. Because she was a woman, she was weak, unstable, foolish, threatening for men, inclined to evil, the devil's ally, and her gender made her exposed. The context of the trials, courts and church. The trials were secular criminal trials, and local courts in Finnmark acted on their own and were allowed to pass death sentences. This was first instance court. Second instance court was the court of appeal, where the judge came traveling up to Finnmark only every third year and held trials along the coast. Then the church. Ministers took part in pre-trial questioning, but not during the trial, and took part in preparing the convicted persons before execution. The preaching was influenced by Danish sermon books, among others by Niels Hemmingsen and Jesper Brochmann. We enter into the last witchcraft panic in Finnmark from November 1662 to April 1663. You see the figure, all those involved are the names we see around the circle, and you see the arrows going from one person can go to 1, 2, 3, 4 other persons. So this we see denunciations, names of other people given. We see an escalation of cases, only females, 20 women executed, 6 small girls accused, but was acquitted by the Court of Appeal judge. 10th of March 1663. 4 women are brought before the court at Vardøhus, mighty men in the courtroom. The governor himself interrogated. Trials since November, and after the new year, 8 women burned at Steilneset, the place of the gallows. First is Margrethe Jonsdatter. She lived in Vardø, had been a maid in Tromsø, denounced already by 2 imprisoned women, and had been brought before the court 3 times previously. So she had long been in the suspicious light. She refused the day before, on 9th of March, to confess, went through the water ordeal and floated. And the water ordeal was considered as God's judgment. It was a circumstantial evidence, a signal of guilt. And the idea behind this was that water was a sacred element that repelled evil. So an evil witch, when she was thrown into the water, she would float. And if she sank, she was pulled onto the shore by a rope around her waist. Margrethe Jonsdatter confessed the 10th of March. She had learned witchcraft, entered into the Devil's Pact, participated in a witches' gathering on Midsummer Eve on Witch Mountain Duhamel, participated in chasing fish from the shore, and in casting witchcraft on a ship of Bergen merchant sailing on Finnmark. Next, Sigrid Jonsdatter, same date before the court, lived in Vardø, confessed. The evil Satan came to her in the likeness of a dog and wanted her service. Eventually, she promised this, and in return, all her doings would be successful. She got a mark from the devil on her little finger's uttermost joint, tried her art on a pig if it worked, and the pig died. Participated in the witches' gathering on Duhamel, and chased the fish away with stalks of seaweed. Cast witchcraft on the ship of a Bergen merchant. And this is a watercolor again by Liljenskjold, the Witch Mountain Duhamel outside Vardø. And this is how an artist has figured this witches' gathering or Sabbath. And you recognize the figure in the middle to be worshipped with horns and hoofs. Next is Gundel Olsdatter. She came to Finnmark from Senja, refused to know witchcraft, wanted the water ordeal, and floated like a bob. Confessed to have learned the art from a woman in Ofoten, received the art through a drink of beer. Satan came to her in the likeness of a crow, and she promised to serve her personal god called Morten. In return, she was promised good fortune with livestock and else. In the likeness of a seal, she chased fish from the shore, and in the guise of a crow, she attended witches' gathering on Duhamel, where the wicked Satan, old Erik, joined them in the shape of a crow. Common features in the confessions of these 3: renouncing baptism, the Devil's Pact, confession of gatherings resulted in denunciations, confessed to shape-shifting, night flights and dances, but in Finnmark, no confession of sex with the devil. So this is different from further south in Europe. So demonology has slightly different versions. However, the main elements are intact. The last one, Dorette Paulsdatter, lived in Vardø, born on Hamarøy, refused to confess to witchcraft, but said she once had received a drink of beer which made her feel unwell. So she started scrutinizing her mind if she might have got witchcraft into her without knowing it. The water ordeal at her own request, and she floated. No judgment passed. She disappears from the records, and this very night she was tortured to death at the rack at Vardø, her limbs stretched in different directions. Next day, trials continued as if nothing special had happened. Death sentences passed on the 3 first. 3-4 days later, the 3 sentenced women burned alive at Steilneset, tied to a ladder which was toppled onto a burning pyre. The corpse of Dorette Paulsdatter dragged out to Steilneset and burned together with the 3. In total, we see in the witchcraft trials in Finnmark a deterrent system, fear on all levels, lay and learned, torture, the rack, sulfur on the breast, burning with red-hot iron, handcuffs, foot chain. So why this torture? Because witchcraft was a crimen acceptum, not possible to prove. The proof was a confession from the accused person's mouth. And why did they confess? Water ordeal, torture, fear of torture, exhausted, looking towards their own death only, and thus sealing the death sentence. Witchcraft trials were an assault on women. It's a massive overweight of women, and there is a clear connection statistically. Women, torture, the devil's pact, witches' gatherings, denunciations, witchcraft panics, and a high execution rate. So I go over to Steilneset Memorial, which is part of Norwegian scenic routes. It's built to commemorate the victims of the Finnmark witchcraft trials, and there are 2 buildings, a long and narrow building, 135 meters long, and a glass pavilion. Opened 2011 by Her Majesty Queen Sonja, and from the left, Jerry Goroway from Louise Bourgeois Atelier, Her Majesty Queen Sonja, me, and Peter Sumtor. Based on 3 components, art, architecture, and history. And invited to Steilneset project, the architect Peter Sumtor, artist Louise Bourgeois, and me as a historian. And the 2 buildings are drawn by Sumtor, and they have different expressions. In the long building, silence, the visitor must pass all the 91 text panels, painful history. The pavilion, anger, revenge, reflection, the symbolic action, Louise Bourgeois, the damned, the possessed, and the beloved. I had contact with both artist and architect when I started writing the text panels. Louise Bourgeois sent questions that I answered on accused women's situation. Who were they? How did they live? Sumtor came to Vardø in 2007 to decide on the site. And in 2008, I went together with Reidun Laura Andreasen to Switzerland to meet Sumtor, and he asked, what society was it that burned their women? He saw trials particularly affecting women. We agreed on text, historical correct, simple, focus on individuals, and only the 91 panels in the room. Nothing else to compete with the fates. So, when writing this text, what did I want to show? My aim was to lift forth, make visible, and honor the 91 victims. I wanted to show the extent, visualize a large number of trials, give each individual a name and a voice. And the majority of female names you see when walking through the long building. I want to include time, place, and development of the trial, the verdict and sentence. And my respect for the victims is expressed by subdued language style, nothing exaggerated. Here is the original court records of Lisbeth Nilsdatter. And here is the text panel. So you see clearly her name, and the last sentence in most of the text panels when you walk through the long building is, in Norwegian, dømt til ild og bål, sentenced to death in fire at the stake. I came first to Steilneset the day before the opening, and I experienced how Steilneset Memorial, due to art, aesthetic qualities, and symbolic power, managed to give the victims a dignity they never experienced in life. There is a connection to our time. Steilneset Memorial is more than history. It shows mechanisms which connect to parallel assaults today, for instance, use of torture to press forth confessions. In addition, violence against women is focused, creating a link to a global problem today. In such a context, Steilneset Memorial becomes a reminder of painful history and a warning about injustice and violation that we shall not tolerate. I will close with the next generation. The insight that Steilneset Memorial carries forth is important knowledge for the young. A teaching package for junior secondary school is developed by Vardø Museum, particularly led by Synnøve Fotland Eikevik, and the school class is coming to Steilneset and staying one day together with the teacher. Afterwards, they write poems, what they experienced at Steilneset. And a girl writes, Det var stille der, hun ble dømt til dødens bål, men var uskyldig. It was quiet there. She was sentenced to death in fire at the stake, but was innocent. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, welcome back to the Steilneset Symposium. The second session's theme is Steilneset Memorial as a catalyst for action against femicide. And our first speaker is Synnøve Fotland Eikevik, who is a conservator at Varanger Museum, at the Vardø Museum in Finnmark. She has a master's degree in cultural studies from the University of Bergen, 2003, on a thesis of pornographic narratives in folkloristic perspectives. And she has published several articles based on her thesis. The fields of work are the witchcraft trials in Finnmark and the dissemination of Steilneset Memorial, the partisan movement in Finnmark during the post-World War II period, and curation of the collections of the Vardø Museum. She has contributed to developing a teaching package about Steilneset Memorial for junior secondary schools. Synnøve.
First of all, I would like to say, not happy International Women's Day, because the way I see it, it's not a celebration, but a continuous fight for equality, and we don't celebrate until we're equal in all ways. So until then, keep up the good fight. I am honored and humbled to be in the company, both digital and physical, of so many interesting and fine female scholars. We are here today to focus on femicide in the past, present, and last but not least, how to work forward to create the premises for a better world for our daughters and sons, free of such crimes against humanity as femicide is. The tragedy of femicide and how it's been handled in our society sometimes make me wonder if all those holding the power actually realizes this. I work at Vardø Museum and have for the last 10 years been responsible for the dissemination of Steilneset Memorial. And we that work in museums sometimes come across as a group, I think, like someone not only that inhabit these grey and dusty institutions, and that we also forget that there is not only a past, but a present and a future to look after and preserve. And we as museum professionals can have an impact on both present and future. As I see it, we are given a responsibility for the past, our cultural heritage, but not to conserve it, but rather to make it understandable in the present, to possibly change the future. Because sometimes our past and our heritage is traumatic and difficult. So not to realize that is to take away from ourselves and the future generation the knowledge on how to use that to our benefit. To shed light on history is to understand what we can change. Through how we disseminate this story, how we lift up and face the troubled past will, as I see it, in the end make an impact on how our visitors, from children to the average museum guest, understand the society we live in today. Shortly said, my job in connection to traumatic history is to make it relevant today. With regards to witchcraft trials, to talk about human rights instead of witches on broomsticks, to try and understand the mechanisms of bullying, to looking at the witchcraft trials, to talk about women's rights movement and feminism, because 84% of the victims were women, to talk about femicide, because it happened in the 17th century and it happens today. And women are the targets, simply because they are women. Museums are mainly non-commercial enterprises, so that the pursuit of profit is not always necessary, rather its role is to disseminate and manage a common heritage. The museum has several responsibilities when it comes to the dissemination of painful cultural heritage. One is simply telling the story. This should be done in a restrained and dignified manner, without sentimentality or too much emotion, allowing numbers and archive materials to come into their own, speaking the language of the time. The challenge is to avoid the commercial notion of witches while telling the story of belief in witches and magic and the tragic outcome it can have when those ideas were allowed to thrive in the chambers of power. The practice a museum has within our professional area is important, especially when we look at how we perform specific tasks, how we disseminate traumatic history, for instance. It could be informative and at the same time reflective. And the basic ideals defines what a museum is in a greater context than just the local history. On the one hand, in administering our common heritage, regionally and nationally, it is our goal to be available to everyone in the local community as well as visitors. And in such a way, there will be no financial obstacles either. On the other hand, the museum is obliged by the state to contribute to our running costs, and thus we must not only disseminate our fields of responsibilities, but also promote arrangements for the public that are linked to them, whether it's guiding, exhibitions, or city tours. All represent different ways to presenting historical events. But we are at a crossroad here, because if we wish to disseminate knowledge and cultural heritage tied to places that we manage, then dissemination must take place at these places with the people we bring to these places. And with people, I also include tourists. How do we do it? And what are the challenges when the story we are responsible for disseminating is both painful and difficult? What we today would call persecution and the mass murder of innocent people. What language and concepts should be used in such context, not to mention how do we perform this in a dignified manner. The museum started a pilot project in 2012 to identify and explore the options linked to such a special place as Steilneset Memorial. The witchcraft trials tell a story that's associated with painful cultural heritage, and as such, it is a topic that requires an unconventional approach to dissemination. The museum have over the years developed a dissemination project, and our target group is 8th grade in junior high school. We engage a drama teacher, a philosopher, and an art educator. In addition to Svein Rønning, that was the curator for National Tourist Roads, and Liv Helene Willumsen, who is Norway's leading expert in this field. Together, we developed a methodology that aims to invite reflection over the events of this century. Although it has also been a significant point for us that we draw parallels with contemporary events, allowing comparisons to be made with the mechanisms that occurred during the witch hunts of the 1600s. In this way, we think we give pupils a deeper understanding of the mentality that prevails when state violations occur on the kind of scale that happened at Steilneset. But also that similar violations are happening today, only under different slogans and ideologies. People are still being persecuted on the basis of their gender, religion, political beliefs, and sexuality. The teaching program called Gundel's Travel is threefold: history, art, and conversation. The first part will focus on the story. The second will concentrate on the art and architecture. The third will be the museum visiting the students a time after they have been to Steilneset Memorial, to talk and reflect over their experiences at the site. And the method is what we refer to as philosophical dialogue, and is opening for all views and reflections around the visit. The idea is that all the impressions on site will be more settled after a while, and the pupils are more able to express their impressions. Both the visit and the philosophical dialogue will come with preparatory studies and supplementary tasks for the schools. Our educational programs are based on the national curricula, concentrating on mandatory subjects, history and Norwegian language. We invite students to learn about one of the younger victims, hoping that they will empathize with her and her situation. And through the program based on drama teaching method, which requires students themselves to be active, disseminate the history through dialogue and drama. This is then followed by a visit down to the memorial. And the students go to the memorial hall before stopping in the House of Flames. They are there asked to write down their immediate impressions in 3 words. These they will use later in the program when they begin work on the process writing. In short, they use the impressions and associations they felt during the visit in the writing of what will end as a short line poem, and I think Liv Helene Willumsen was showing us one of those earlier today. The work will be continued and finished at school. And during the follow-up visit to the schools by the museum's mediator, we aim to use philosophical conversation practice to discuss and investigate the experiences and impressions they have had at the memorial. The final program will mainly deal with art and architecture, and there will be various tasks directing more focus, connecting this to the content of Steilneset Memorial. It may seem difficult for some to relate to art, and especially architecture, as something that is representing or reflecting on death and tragedy. There are complex considerations related to this aspect of dissemination. This will also be the most dynamic part of the program. And for us at the museum, it's important to focus on the individuals who were the victims of witchcraft cases. They were people of flesh and blood, just like you and me. To convey that history entails telling tales of courage, powerlessness, power, fear, uncertainty, pain, and loss. That those killed were people with families and hopes, thoughts and feelings, as we all have. There was nothing special that made them more suspicious than others. Yet they were convicted of being in league with the devil, a character that's abstract. There was no concrete evidence that could be used to justify the verdict. Yet they were condemned, tortured, and burned alive. If you understand this narrative as one dealing with human beings and not one concerned with the notion of witches, especially in a popular cultural perspective, it becomes much more painful to accept. Another aspect of the history of witchcraft trials is that it contains ethical and moral issues. Museums ethics, especially connected to ICOM's Code of Ethics for Museums, not only in relation to research, but through all aspects of museum work. Museums are at present more and more active moral actors in society. This means that we focus a great deal on documentation around the modern and present society. We are no longer supposed to be neutral actors in our local community, but dare to take a stand in relevant questions concerning our community and society. Therefore, it's also imperative to have a distance to our politicians and other instances that's responsible for the mission we are given. Ethical dissemination of traumatic history demands a conscious approach from the museum on how we choose our methods and the narrative we use in our educational programs, by giving history a relevance to a modern world, and also we want to avoid making it into something that's sensational or populistic. To understand our past through our present by putting historic events in perspective and at the same time giving the victims respect and redemption. Look at the individual victim and tell their story will help putting a lived life and a face to those subjected to the crimes of the authorities. And this symposium is dedicated to a global pandemic, femicide. And Steilneset Memorial is a reminder of the rigid structures in society that still exists today. The fact that it's relevant today is a challenge when it comes to basic human rights all over the world. Steilneset Memorial is that whispering voice from the past telling us that femicide existed, it just didn't have a name. Women were persecuted on the basis of being women. One can argue that what happened at Steilneset 4 years ago is not the same as one in many ways define and understand the notion femicide today. Some scholars refer to femicide as extreme violence towards women that ends in murder, and that the violence against them happens because they are women. Like the women that died at the stake 400 years ago. Because they were women, they were more vulnerable than men to the magic powers of nature and the devil. Therefore, they were accused in a much larger scale than men for being witches and for taking part in a pact with the devil. Women today are also far more subjected for domestic abuse than men. Far more women than men are exposed to harassment. Harassment that in the worst case scenario ends in death for the woman. Femicide also includes a group of women that dare to speak up or claims the right to be heard, especially in societies with a strong patriarchal system culturally and religiously. In these cases, one often sees the death of these women as a way of restoring the peace or system and will not be defined as femicide. And when we talk about Steilneset Memorial with our public or visitors or students or pupils, we talk about femicide in a context that we put into perspective that Steilneset is not only a historical place, but also a place to be reminded that we still have challenges in our modern world that concerns women's life, health, and basic human rights. It's an opening to widen their perspective and open for dialogue around important topics with a global dimension. It opens a space for the museum to have a dialogue with our visitors, and not the least, like I mentioned before, the local community we serve, to debate issues that concerns us all in a manner that possibly can make the museum an arena for debate and discussions on topics like human rights, women's rights equality, and down to how we treat each other, how we interact, and why we interact as we do as humans. By doing this, we as a museum can achieve a position as a relevant institution that brings the world to a small community and brings the small community into the world. Femicide is a cultural problem and museums are cultural institutions. And sometimes I believe that we have a reputation that we only preserve the past and are not interested in being a relevant voice in the political and public debate around these important questions concerning, among other things, human rights and violence directed towards women. To the museum, as I said, has been important when we are developing Steilneset Memorial and the history, that we use terms like human rights. The museum is an active part of our society, and by putting this term into something that happened 400 years ago, when this term did not even exist, we try to show that the past isn't an isolated happening, but can reflect on unjust happenings today. We know that in some parts of the world or societies, cultures exist that believe in witchcraft, and that witchcraft trials happens, and especially women and children are targeted. Another thing is the use of torture during interrogations in the witchcraft trials, and this in connection to Steilneset Memorial also exemplifies how relevant it is in the modern debate about human rights and democracy. Of the 77 women being accused in the witchcraft trials in Finnmark, we know about at least 2 of them were exposed for such extreme torture during the interrogation that they died from it. Those women were Ingeborg, Peder Krog's wife, and Dorette, Paul's daughter. They denied being guilty, and the fact that they were tortured before they confessed tells us that the accusers used methods that was against the law at the time. It was not allowed to use torture as a means to get more confessions or to get the accused to turn in other women that were supposed to be witches. In fact, torture was only allowed after the woman confessed. The parallels to our time are sadly too similar. We know that in the name of the state, law enforcement and other regimes, that torture is actively used as a means to threaten people and to force them into either confessing or as punishment for being in opposition to the norms of this society. In the case of femicide, torture can and do get used as a way of putting women into what the society thinks is their place, if they had protested against a rigid regime or against the way women are treated as unequals. It is our job as museum professionals to also talk about this when we meet our public, and not least in our educational program. And I have talked to Liv Helene Willumsen about this, and I was also then allowed to end this talk with a quote from one of her lectures. The witchcraft trials in Finnmark in 1600 to 1692 took place towards the end of a period that saw persecution of witches all over Europe. Wherever witches were being persecuted, the state played an important part. The powers of the state were ingrained in the legislation, in the functioning of the judiciary, and in the activities of the church. There is no doubt that royal powers, together with the activities of the king's officials, were decisive for the outcome of the trials. We see arbitrary accusation, pressure during interrogation, and the use of torture forced the accused woman or man to confess. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Our next speaker in the second session is Yaba Badoe. She is a Ghanaian British documentary filmmaker, journalist, and author. Born in Ghana, she got her education in England, graduating at King's College, Cambridge. She has published short stories and novels. As a documentary filmmaker, she has worked on the theme of race and racism in Black and White from 1987, I Want Your Sex from 1991, and Witches' Camps in North Ghana is the topic of her documentary, The Witches of Gambaga. Thank you.
Good afternoon again from London. My name is Yaba Badoe, and I'm a filmmaker born in Ghana, a dual national of Britain and Ghana. In this talk, I want to reflect on some of the challenges I faced when making my documentary film, The Witches of Gambaga. Thank you for inviting me to be here this afternoon. All of you can watch the documentary by going to my website, yababadoe.com. If you want to find out more about the challenges in a more organized academic way, you can read a feature I wrote for Feminist Africa 16, which is free and available online. The feature is called Representing Witches in Contemporary Ghana, Challenges and Reflections on Making the Witches of Gambaga. Right now, I'm going to proceed without images or PowerPoint or bullet points, because I want you to try to understand how I and other like-minded activists became so concerned about the lives of women condemned to live as witches in northern Ghana that we made a film to highlight their stories. I also want you to appreciate what drew me into spending so much of my life trying to get a sense of what it means to be a witch in northern Ghana. When I started researching residents at the witches camp in Gambaga in 2004, this is academic research, I was part of a Pan-African mapping sexualities program devised and coordinated by the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town in collaboration with the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Back then, I didn't appreciate that 6 years later, we would still be trying to finish a film based on my research, nor did I anticipate that I would find myself identifying so strongly with the refrain I heard over and over again from women living at the camp when I asked them to tell me their life stories. Where do I begin? Mahawa, the spokeswoman of Mamprusi-speaking women, asked me. I just don't know how to begin, said Asana, another woman. And yet another said, when I grew up, nothing eventful happened to me until I was brought to this place, thereby highlighting a central theme of almost all the 19 narratives that I collected and analyzed. All the women I spoke to and spent time with at the camp framed their disparate life stories as a series of events that climaxed in the drama that precipitated their arrival in Gambaga. Whether a woman had chosen Gambaga as a place of refuge or had been exiled there by her family, the events that brought her to the witches' camp and forced her to remain there were an important defining feature in her life. Now, to me and my life, how do I begin to describe how a group of around 100 poor, middle-aged and elderly Mamprusi, Dagomba and Kakomba-speaking women condemned to live as witches in a camp in the small provincial town of Gambaga, bewitched me to such an extent that I and other women who care about women's rights were determined to have their voices heard and make a film that would support efforts to change their circumstances. There were many hurdles that Amina Mama, my co-producer, and I had to overcome as we negotiated various institutional and interpersonal relationships to eventually complete the documentary in 2009, many years after I first met the women in 1995 and had an idea to make a documentary about them. In the end, the completion and dissemination of the Witches of Gambaga was possible because we were able to draw on the support of African women activists, as well as friends and allies around the world who cared enough about violence meted out to women accused of witchcraft in Ghana to want to change it. For my part, I first heard about the witches' camp in Gambaga in January 1995 from a civil servant at the Ministry of Social Welfare in Tamale, the capital of the northern region of Ghana. At the time, I was working as a stringer for the BBC World Service, making radio documentaries and filing stories for a program called Network Africa. My remit was to find human interest stories outside Accra. So in March that same year, I made my first trip to Gambaga. I intended to work quickly and finish the job in time to catch the last bus home, last bus back to Tamale at 4:30 that afternoon. Before I could talk to a single one of the 160 women who were then living at the witches' camp, I had to get permission from their custodian, the chief of Gambaga, the Gambarana. To my astonishment, he refused. He wouldn't give me permission because such a decision, he claimed, was political in nature, and the only person capable of taking it was the district commissioner of East Mamprusi. And since the commissioner, Mr. Kusi, was out of town for the day, I'd have to wait. In 1995, there were few mobile phones in northern Ghana. In fact, telecommunications in the north was negligible, making it impossible to contact Mr. Kusi to find out when he'd be back. So I waited anxiously with my interpreter in a local restaurant not far from the Gambarana's residence. Just to give you a picture of what Gambaga looks like, it's a bedraggled, uninviting town, a dusty provincial settlement that looks as if it's survived in spite of everything. Compared to the southern part of Ghana, the north has been sadly neglected and exploited as a source of cheap labor. In the 1990s, when I first visited that part of Ghana, the impact of IMF structural adjustment programs on the region was particularly severe, so much so that 70% of the population, mostly small-scale farmers, were living in extreme poverty. Infant and maternal mortality rates have remained high, and health and nutrition in the north today are among the worst in Ghana. Mr. Kusi returned home later that afternoon, hours after the last bus had left town. As soon as I explained my mission, he gave me permission to proceed and willingly agreed to do an interview. He acknowledged centuries of superstition with a shrug. Tradition is the voice of the people, he smiled, and since the people believed in witchcraft and found it expedient to expel witches to Gambaga, there was not much anyone could do about it. The people have spoken. In the few minutes it took to confirm the laissez-faire approach of successive Ghanaian governments, dusk had fallen. Eager to assist me in any way he could, the district commissioner drove me to the residence of the local Presbyterian Presbyterian minister, Reverend Awindago. The Reverend worked with the witches on a daily basis and knew them well. He agreed to act as my interpreter. Then he took me to the Gambarana, and after he had added his consent to the commissioners for good measure, the chief instructed his son, Abukari, to accompany me to the witches' camp. By now it was night. There was no electricity in Gambaga, and I could scarcely see in front of me. The only light available was a kerosene lantern that Abukari held aloft. He led me behind the royal compound down a track. We arrived at what seemed to be the entrance of a large compound. Inside, 15 or so women were waiting. After I'd introduced myself, Abukari informed me that I was to interview 3 of the 160 residents at the camp at that time. The 3 oldest in their compounds, they'd lived at the camp for years and would speak on behalf of everyone present. Fumbling to find the record button of my cassette player, for despite a few lamps blinking in the night, I could barely see, I started recording. One after the other, I interviewed Zabie, Dua, and Tia, 3 old women in threadbare bare clothes. I have the dimmest recollection of what they looked like. What I recall is that lamplight lengthened the shadows on their faces. Eyes glinted in the half-light as I asked my questions. Faces inched closer to mine. What had brought them to Gambaga, I asked, and how did they survive? Their stories confused me. Zabia, a mother of 3 and a grandmother, spoke in a voice raw with remorse. Her older brother had accused her of witchcraft when his son had died. When I arrived here, she said, I was full of regret for having bewitched the boy. I prayed that once the Gambarana had accepted me and I was living here with him, my thoughts would never go back to bewitching somebody's child again. That was Zabia. Dua, on the other hand, whose life had been scarred by physical and verbal abuse until her brother brought her to the safety of the camp, appeared to relish her disreputable past. I accepted I was a witch, she confessed. I wasn't tried by ordeal or anything because I knew I was a witch. So when I was brought here, I told the Gambarana, I chopped all those people they're talking about. I killed all the young men and women in my neighborhood. Sensing bravado close to insanity in Dua, I pressed her to disclose her method for killing so many people. She simply repeated her assertion. She was a mass murderer, she claimed, of the highest order, a queen among witches. Titters rippled through the gathering as Dua proclaimed her infamy for the world to hear. Only one of the three women I spoke to, Tia, refuted allegations that had been made against her. Tia believed that she'd been wrongly accused of witchcraft. The instant she voiced her innocence, Abukari, the chief's son, shouted her down. Mistakes are never made in Gambaga, he insisted. The ritual never lies. The old woman backed down immediately. However, that single note of dissension struck a chord in me. Up till then, I'd been asking questions with a consciousness grounded in the ostensibly rational landscape of BBC journalism. I knew that elements of a feature were falling into place and that the long journey from Accra had been worthwhile. I was holding any reservations I felt in check while I probed the parameters of the women's lives. And yet, as I asked my questions and recorded their replies, I was beginning to sense something else happening. It was as if, against my will, I was being dragged into a compelling collective narrative. In the face of combined acquiescence, Tia alone had spoken out. What ritual? I inquired. What are you talking about? Abukari intervened again. Women are by nature witches, he explained, while men are more likely to be thieves. He went on to disclose that thanks to powers vested in him by his ancestors, the Gambarana is able to determine if a woman is a witch. So, when a woman is accused of witchcraft is brought to him, she is subjected to a trial by ordeal. But if the Gambarana kills a chicken, if it dies face down, the woman is a witch. But if it dies, its wings facing the sky, then the woman is exonerated, her innocence accepted. Apparently, Tia's trial by ordeal had gone against her. She'd been a resident of the witches' camp, she told me, for over 25 years. The women I spoke to didn't know their ages, and when they tried to quantify the number of years they'd stayed at Gambaga, 25, 30, the figures they quoted were not necessarily accurate, though it was clear that each of them had spent many years at the camp. Tia had recently been joined by a daughter who was seated beside her. Witchcraft can be passed on, supposedly, from a mother to her daughter. Men aren't exempt from witchcraft, I learned. Tia told me that while she'd been living at the camp, 3 men had been convicted of witchcraft, but none was detained for longer than 3 years. Within 3 years, they'd been able to buy their freedom, giving the Gambarana the sheep and money necessary to leave. Men are also witches, Tia claimed, but they have the upper hand. They have homes to go to. But a woman has no home in our system. Would you like more men to stay at the camp, I asked. Tia snorted in derision. Let the men stay by themselves, she retorted. They should leave us alone. The women laughed, bringing the interviews to an end. After I thanked everyone present, I was led down a path into a building I couldn't make out. A door was pushed ajar. I was taken inside. The kerosene lamp revealed the outline of a low, narrow bed. Thanks to Mr. Kusi, this was to be my room for the night. I lay down exhausted, emotionally drained, my shoes still on. Not surprisingly, sleep eluded me that night. My mind, immersed in the day's events, refused to rest. I recalled Tia's flash of rebellion, and then a moment later, the ritual that decides a woman's future. It seemed unbelievable that in the final decade of the 20th century, the death throes of a fowl could determine innocence or guilt and lead to years of incarceration, and that this was happening in my country of origin, a country that had signed conventions on the rights of women, and that this was happening not far from where I was born, was horrifying. During the course of that long, sleepless night, witches became more than an object of my curiosity. The narrative I'd sensed encroaching on me crept into my consciousness. I was able to hold it at bay while the lantern shone. Its light dimmed gradually, and when the glow of the wick was snuffed out by night, a question sprang to mind. What if I was accused of witchcraft and a trial by ordeal performed? What if the trial went against me? In a town with no working telephones, how could I get word to my family in Accra? What would I do? I couldn't get the thought out of my mind. But for an accident of birth, I too could be a witch. I could be one of them. As soon as day broke, I literally fled Gambaga for Tamale and the long journey back to Accra, where I spoke to anyone who would listen, relatives, academics, friends, old and young, about the impoverished elderly women I'd encountered at Gambaga. I spoke of the camp, a place of sanctuary, a site of punishment as well, and of what I'd learned about the ritual that could destroy a woman's reputation with the tremor of a wing. 9 years after that first visit, I returned to Gambaga to record and analyze the life stories of women forced to live as witches as a first step to making a film about them. To my surprise, the Gambarana remembered me. But this time, since I was working with the support of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, he didn't have a problem allowing me to talk to the women in his custody. In daylight, with all but the oldest residents out working on farms, the camp seemed mundane, an expanse of disheveled mud huts inhabited by a few crones. All in all, 19 women told me their stories. Azara lost her house and restaurant in 1997 when she was accused of starting a meningitis epidemic and was thrown out of her village. Awabu was tortured for days to extract a confession from her. Bintuk was on the run for 3 months, chased by her accusers before she found refuge at Gambaga. Asana was tortured by her brother, who threatened to pluck out her eyes if she didn't confess to witchcraft. Despite the extraordinarily powerful testimonies I collected, halfway through my research, I still couldn't decide how to make a film that required immersion in a completely different way of looking at the world. How do you introduce an international audience to a worldview that appears superstitious without making the subjects of the film seem backward? That was a question I asked myself again and again. I didn't know how I could frame discussions about witchcraft until I heard Amina Wumbala's story and determined that for her sake and for all the other women who'd spoken to me, somehow or other, we had to make the film. Amina was unwell the morning I interviewed her, and having returned to her hut early after gleaning millet beneath the intense November sun, she was shivering. She was shivering as she spoke to me urgently, without the usual pauses and hesitations, without any prompting on my part, as if she felt compelled to speak out. This is an edited version of what she told me. After my husband died, I decided to return to my father's house. My brothers accepted me, giving me a room. One day, it was threatening to rain, so we all ran to fetch containers to collect rainwater. The next morning, all the containers were full except for mine. So I asked, "Where's my water?" My brother replied that I should ask his wife. So I asked her, "Where's my water?" we started arguing. My brother came out and said I shouldn't insult his wife, for if I insult her, I'm insulting him as well. He said I should get out of the house, but the house belongs to all of us. It's our father's house, and he doesn't have the right to throw me out. My brother struck me. That very night, he died. His children claimed that I killed him with witchcraft. So they came after me with people from the largest houses in the village. They beat me until they thought they'd killed me. Luckily, my senior son arrived and drove everyone away. But the next day, the villagers carried me across the water and dumped me on the other side of the river, calling me a witch. I lay there for a full day and night before I felt strong enough to get up and walk to Gambaga. Amina's account, like those of several other women, reveals that a witch is often an assertive, argumentative, determined woman, a woman capable of antagonizing those around her and challenging male authority. And when her righteous anger is followed by a calamitous event, the ultimate sanctions of communal violence, followed by expulsion from her home, silence her dissenting voice, thus reinscribing the normative patriarchal order. In my investigations on witchcraft in Gambaga, only one woman, the businesswoman and trader Azara, was prepared to discuss what she knew about witchcraft beliefs with me. All the other inmates at the camp and women in the town pleaded ignorance. It was as if revealing any knowledge on the subject would suggest that a woman was a practitioner, implicating her in the dark arts. Men, on the other hand, were voluble in providing me with humorous anecdotes and vivid descriptions of their encounters with witches and witchcraft. Indeed, a town elder, Alhaji Isaku, regaled me for a full hour on how, when men are witches, they use their art for benign protective purposes, while women, because of their nature, always use it to execute evil deeds. It was heartbreaking that men can describe and articulate ideas about witchcraft, defining who is and is not a witch, while for the most part, women are silenced by it. At the end of our conversation, during which Alhaji Isaku told me that witches can turn themselves into animals and insects and snakes, they can turn the souls of their victims into rodents, they have 4 eyes to enable them to travel by night and have a tendency to go blind, for by the time they're old, they've ruined their eyesight with too much night travel. After he'd revealed that a witch will never confess to witchcraft and that witchcraft can never be eradicated from a woman, it can only be suppressed, he described how a cantankerous nature and manifestations of male pride in a woman are all signs that a woman may be a witch. After he told me all these things, he mentioned in passing that if I wanted, and if I bought him a bat and a cat, he would gladly turn me into a witch. I declined his offer. Thank you for listening to me. And please watch the film on my website. Bye.
Our next speaker, hopefully, is Silvia Federici. She's an Italian-American scholar, teacher, author, and feminist activist. She's Professor Emerita and Teaching Fellow at Hofstra University in New York State, where she was a social science professor. Among her books are Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation from 2004, and Witches from 2021. We're all a little bit excited to hear Silvia. I hope she's wonderful.
Good morning and greetings to all. I'm Silvia Federici. I speak to you from New York, and I want to first say, express my gratitude for being invited to this symposium, and add that I've been profoundly moved by the presentation that have been made by the women who have spoken before me. I'm part of a generation of feminists who, in the 1970s, in the process of wanting to rewrite our history and seeking answers to the causes of discrimination against women into the past, we discovered the witch hunts. And I can say that for myself, and I know that this was true for other women, this was an event that changed my life. I remember the many nights in which reading, the history, the description of what was done to women, the processes that for centuries led them to the stake. I could not sit. I had to walk because I was so emotionally drained and terrified, thinking of what those women must have felt, the terror that must have possessed them. And I committed myself to try to give voice to those whose voice had been suffocated, and to make sure that the witch hunt was not again forgotten, as it had been systematically, because until very, very recently, and in very sporadic cases, witch hunting, the history of persecution of the so-called witches, has never entered any classroom. It has been studied only by a very select group of historians. Well, the feminist movement has changed that. And I'm part of the women who I think have contributed to really rethink, what were the factors that motivated the fact that across large parts of Europe, and then, across the ocean into the so-called New World, thousands and thousands of women were arrested, accused of the most horrible crime, accused of being enemies of God, of humanity, of society, of having made a pact with the devil. And I think we now are in a better position to understand that, in fact, contrary to what has often been claimed, the witch hunts of the 16th, 17th, 18th century Europe were not the fruit of a popular delusion, but they were the fruit of decision making at the highest level of institutional power. And they were very much a product of the processes that accompanied the rise of capitalist relation in Europe. Massive dispossession of land, impoverishment, increasing encroachment of monetary relation in every aspect of life, a price revolution that made even the most immediate necessities of life, out of reach for a large population, the growth of social inequality, and the breakdown of communal solidarity. Added to that, the institution of new forms of control, whereby the state increasingly began to take over, the control of the body of women, procreation, sexuality, all functional to the new work discipline that were being put into place, into this period. So we now have, I think, a better understanding of the processes that in the so-called period of primitive accumulation, the period that laid the condition for the development of capitalist relations throughout Europe and beyond, have instigated, any conflict in the communities after communities that, are at the source of the witch hunt. They were the source of the witch hunt. However, as I and other women were carrying on this kind of investigation, this kind of work, never we imagined, never we expected that in our own lifetime, we would see new witch hunting. That as we were, chanting, tremble, tremble, the witches are back, referring to, our feminist activism. In fact, new witch hunts were underway that by now have claimed the life of thousands and thousands of women. Yaga Badoe speak about the witches' camps in Africa, in Ghana. And I understand that now witches' camps have also grown in other parts of Africa. But witch hunting since the 1980s to present has actually spread not only throughout Africa, but India, Papua New Guinea, East Timor. And in fact, we have seen cases recently of witch hunting also in Latin America and in the Middle East. So what is instigating this return? I think that the work that I've done and other women have done, looking at the structural factor that caused witch hunting in the early phase of capitalist development, in the formation of modern Europe, has also enabled us to realize that once again, behind these new horrible persecutions, we find the processes that relate to the expansion of capitalist relations across the world. And Yaga Badoe already has spoken, of the importance of the reforms that were introduced in the name of structural adjustment, as presumably a remedy, to a debt crisis that was highly engineered. But as a consequence of this reform, you had throughout Africa, phenomena of massive impoverishment. Above all, a major social dislocation, to the extent that entire population are in fact being displaced from their ancestral land, that changes are taking place in the legislation governing land tenure, with the dismantling of communal land ownership and the process of titling of land, individualizing the ownership of land, which is a process extremely violent. We also know that structural adjustment has in fact created a process, a situation of hunger, widespread hunger, malnutrition, which has triggered continuous epidemics. COVID is presently receiving much attention because it has affected population in Europe and in the United States. But actually, since the 1980s, epidemics have been a daily reality in large part of the former colonial world, as a direct consequence of the destruction of the basic condition of reproduction. This situation, which also creates a new structural value whereby all activities that are not producing monetary wealth are being devalued, has a direct impact, not only on people in general, but on women in particular, and in particularly older women. Older women, often widowed, living alone, with nobody fighting for them, are among the main target. First of all, because they are seen, like elderly in general, as a burden on their community, and in the face of massive dislocation and impoverishment, is experiencing intensification of conflict about land, conflict about resources, conflict that often oppose people of different generation, as you have a whole younger population who looks at the property, the access to land that some of the elderly have, and particularly women, as illegitimate, insofar that is taking away resources that they see more appropriately used from them. So clearly, the forces that are ahead, that are now fueling witch hunting in so many parts of the world, are forces that are extremely powerful. I think as we fight against the individual cases, of abuse of women, and individual cases, of attack, assault on women accused of witches, and also men. The men, as in the past, are a minority. But certainly it is the case that the men as well, particularly in Africa, and particularly when they return to their villages with some property, with some money, have been often accused of being witches, clearly with the person of expropriating of the small amount of wealth that they had. Actually, I should add that in several countries, Nigeria, for instance, the Congo, Angola, in recent time, children too have been accused of being demonic. And from the reports that I have analyzed, it's clear that they were accused of being demonic when in a way they appear to be rebel, and in particular when they appear to be abusing of the minimum scarce resources that the families had, and consequently were actually pushed into the street and going to add to the growing population of street children. I must add also that the important factor, a catalyst, in triggering this persecution, has been the growing presence, of missionaries and evangelical sects, who, starting in the 1980s, hand in hand, with the process that goes under the name of globalization, hand in hand with the imposition on many governments across the former colonial world of structural adjustment reforms, have entered communities and preached a religion that again depicts misery, misfortune, death as a product of a satanic conspiracy. And they, in fact, instigate people who are confronted daily with the impoverishment, are confronted daily with the fact that even at young age, people are dying, the high rate of infant mortality that Yaga Badoe, was reporting, all having to do with the fact that structural adjustment programs, which have been a form of recolonization, have in fact devastated, the most basic form of social reproduction. And in fact, instead, these, new missionaries, are instigating people to look for the causes of mere misfortune, in their own community, suggesting, instigating suspicion and suggesting that people are conspiring against them. So that very often, we find that the pastor, the local pastor, becomes the witch finder or the exorcist. Both witch finding and exorcism, in fact, have returned on the scene, and often employed by local chiefs who may be working in complicity with foreign companies, with extractivist outfits that are deeply interested, in the displacement of people from their land, and are in fact, interested in whenever possible attacking the most vulnerable member of the community. And of course, women and older women are the most vulnerable member of the community, particularly in context in which the present situation intensifies a pre-existing misogyny, that pre-existing patriarchal view of women. They see them as primarily provider of sexual and reproductive services, so that the older woman, seems to be only a burden, seems to be unproductive, and only a burden to the community. This being the situation, as I said before, it is really important that we think and our struggle, against witch hunting, as part of a whole process, of denunciation, of the transformation that are taking place. It is very easy. It is very easy to see the culprit, to see the young men who round up women, and the family members who accuse, their older mother, or accuse sometime, a family, any family, female part of the family, of being a witch. So the immediate material executor of the witch hunt are very visible. What we need to make visible are instead all the other agents and the institutions that are responsible for creating structural situations that instigated the witch hunt. In something that I wrote years ago, I wrote that there is a parallel between the radical devaluation the women are experiencing today in many parts of the world, particularly in the rural area. There is a connection with the kind of devaluation that, for example, in the eyes of the institution like the World Bank, is now undergoing, affecting this understanding and the value of land. The World Bank tells us that land is valueless unless it is brought to the bank, and used as a collateral, for monetary resources that can be used for different forms of entrepreneurship. And the same is occurring with women. Again, there is a process of radical devaluation at work that I think has very deep structural condition. And this is the structural condition that we also need to address, as we oppose, denounce, and fight against the individual cases, of abuse. To this purpose, starting, in 2019, with various, women in Spain, with the collective of women in Spain, which has been growing over the year, we have launched a memory project. A memory project is a memory of the witch hunts, with the idea that we should begin a process of recuperation of the history of the witch hunts, past and present, to understand, what they actually signified in the life of women. What were their social, economic, and political roots, and what have been the consequences on the life of women, our life, and the life of women across the world. This is a project that has already produced, some important results. For example, a number of groups, study groups, have developed in Spain that have begun in different localities to go to the archives, taking out the documents and describing, persecution that have taken place in the past, and trying to understand who were these women. Who were these women? What were the reasons given? What were the circumstances? I think this kind of history from below is extremely important. It's extremely important because I think that in order to actually engage in the kind of process that we need, to really put an end to this horrible crime, we certainly need, in fact, to better understand, the process whereby, so many women historically could have been described as demonic. To understand what has been the extent and the structural root of the incredible misogyny that animates the witch hunt of the past and the present. And understand from there in what kind of society do we live, whereby women, who have been traditionally and continue to be the life giver, the ones who are most directly responsible, for the maintenance, reproduction of life, materially, emotionally, can be seen as, in fact, producer of that, can be seen as the ultimate, most vicious, most pernicious threat to their communities. So recuperating the voices of women from the past, recuperating the history is important to make the connection with our present. Because as we have been discovering, since in the meetings that we have had since 2019, in the meetings and the analysis that we have done, which have been very, very, very emotional. For example, it has been very powerful and moving for so many women to discover, after going to the archives, that the streets in which they have walked, the streets in which they've gone with their children, they've gone with their lover, the squares in which they have enjoyed some holiday time, are places in which women were tortured and executed. So that connection is extremely important because it enables us to see, how our own life have been shaped, have been, affected, by this past, and enable us to better understand, how we can fight the persecution of the present. This May, from May 19 to May 21st, we are going to have the second meeting in Madrid, of our group. And, we want to extend the invitation to this gathering, which is going, in fact, to look both at the past and in the present. We want to extend to all those who are listening, to my presentation. And, I anticipate that the work that has gone into producing the first encyclopedia on feminicide and a whole powerful volume, of accounts, of witch hunting throughout history is going to be at the very center, of our gathering. And thank you very much.
Okej, vi fortsätter. Our next speaker has a special task today. We have asked Marianna Muravyeva to sum up the presentations that we've heard today. Marianna is a professor of Russian law and administration, the Faculty of Law at the University of Helsinki, with specialization in women's rights and violence against women. Among her publications is domestic violence legislation in Russia, campaigning for change. She has also focused on barriers on achieving gender equality for younger women, including sexual harassment. Marianna.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this symposium. It is dire, difficult times. 2 weeks ago, my reprisal would have been something completely different, but I'm one of those people who are deeply involved in the current conflict, in a Russian aggression against Ukraine. And this situation reminds us again and again that women are on the line, and that the devastation from this particular conflict will impact women, first of all. Well, it will impact countries and it will impact populations, but women are going to be the first survivors and the first receivers of this particular impact. Now, both countries now in conflict are very familiar with witchcraft, with violence against women, with gender-based violence, with anti-gender movements, as well as with toxic militarized masculinities that have been there and that have been applied to prosecute women historically and today. And I've been listening to all the presentations today, and they've addressed a variety of issues that are still extremely important for our contemporary situation despite 2022 and the achievements that women's movement have done, the achievements that as women we have. There's still a lot to go. And I think I liked Synnøve's idea about that there's nothing to celebrate today on March 8th, 2022, because we're not still equal, and there's still a war going on, and women are still they're surviving this war the best they can. But the face of this conflict is particularly masculine, and women are still boxed and portrayed by mass media, by everybody else, as somebody who is displayed, whose bodies signify the horror of that war, whose bodies are going to be raped, and whose bodies are going to be mutilated as a result of the aggression of another country. That particular narrative we've seen in other wars, but then that also is a narrative that doesn't give women a lot of agency. So we've been discussing femicide today. Femicide as continuing violence against women, and femicide as a gender-based related killing of women and girls just because they're women. In witchcraft studies that we've seen done in the past probably 20 years, there was an increasing movement to say, a lot of men said that it's not only women who were accused of witchcraft and are prosecuted and executed for witchcraft, but there were also men, and in some countries, they were predominantly men. So far, we can't really think about these witch hunts as actually femicide or gynecide. So the terminology could vary. So it's not actually women who got targeted for that, but rather specific practices, and it depends on the cultural context of prosecution. We've heard Raisa Toivo's presentation today, in which in Finland, while women were predominantly prosecuted, but they were not executed for witchcraft. And although they still bear stigma of witchcraft, but they were not at least killed for that. Actually, that is something which is a very good example when sort of the topic got hijacked under the idea that as a scholarship we evolve and as new sources come in, so it's much more nuanced and much more complicated picture than just saying that women were prosecuted as witches because they're women. And yet, I think we've seen through our presentations today that a majority of contexts, and it's Liv Helene's context, the Steilneset Museum and monument itself, through artists' work, through Yaba's presentation, through our last presentation, Silvia's presentation, we've seen that actually, despite men, of course, being accused of witchcraft as well, women are still are what we call the archetypical witch, and somebody who gets accused of witchcraft as well as prosecuted of witchcraft, or indeed some other sort of gender-related crimes or gender-related things as because they are women. So this particular sort of debate that is, I usually call it a pseudo-academic debate in a sense that if we should sort of continue with ideas such as femicide or genocide just because the predominant majority of people who become victims or survivors of this particular event are actually women or representatives of particular race, of particular race, is something that usually leads us to sort of moving out of focus of academic discussion. So I think we can agree through listening to the presentations today that witchcraft definitely had been one of the types of femicide, and while in some countries or cultural contexts women didn't get killed for that, but yet there was a potential in there, and that's what I also noticed in Raisa's presentation, that although women didn't get killed, but there was a potential to still for women to be primary victims of witchcraft. In countries, for example, such as Russia and Ukraine, there's been a long tradition of saying that witches were predominantly male. And if you look at the 17th and 18th centuries, in court cases that we sort of all worked with, the men actually have represent a significant, very sizable portion of people accused of witchcraft. But what a lot of these scholars were saying that missing is that while men definitely got prosecuted for some types of witchcraft, it was women who got prosecuted for malefictum, which is the most sort of the dangerous and the grievous crime in the minds of the state at the time, and that they were the ones who got the harshest punishment and got prosecuted. In the 19th century, for example, Russia, there's a book by Christian Vorobek on the possessed. Russia and Ukraine, both countries witnessed the witch hunts in the sense that it was not the authorities that prosecuted women who they thought were possessed by the devil, but the people in local villages burnt and killed them and raped them because they thought they were bringing a plague, or they were harming animals, or they were harming other villages. And I think in Silvia Federici's talk, who showed that we have this recurrent wave of witchcraft, or accusation of witchcraft, of witch hunts and accusations of witch hunts. And Silvia put it in a very particular context of capitalism. I would also put it in a particular context of colonialism, and as again we've seen in Yaba's presentation, also in Liv Helene's presentation and Silvia's presentation on colonialism and race being an important factor in witch hunts. It's not just about all women, it's about how women are structured, constructed and reconstructed and put in a certain context, in a sense that they become the primary body for prosecution. Now, there's an important idea that again have been expressed by several of presentations today. That is the state that prosecutes, And that's the state that introduces the legislation, but also the procedures and prosecutions that are highly misogynic and highly gendered. And I think in the situation of witch hunts, it is absolutely obvious in the prosecution of witchcraft, both historically and today, it is absolutely obvious and clear that it is highly gendered procedures that also put women on the line, and that women become the primary sort of not just suspects, but signifiers of witchcraft. I would ask a question of all the participants today. I'm not sure if they are supposed to answer the questions. I think the question we've been asking for quite some time, and I think again the presentation that connected with today, both our artists and Silvia and Silvia's presentation, is to why is it still happening, and how is it that in a world and where we boast the achievement in human rights and human rights of women, where we've introduced a number of important conventions. I'm not going to go back historically, but starting with the CEDAW Convention and a number of important international documents within international bodies such as the European Union or any other international bodies. How does it still happening that we still have the remnants of witchcraft prosecutions, witch hunts, and at the same time we still have what we know is the core for witch hunts: misogyny, and ascribing women with a certain characteristics that are malicious by definition. In Yaba's presentation, which is a very touching to me, in a sense that Yaba was asking again a fundamental question for researchers, that how do you tell this story and the story of witch prosecutions in Ghana, by not trying to reduce that to a simplistic, barbaric narrative or backward narrative of backwardness in this sort of colonial context, we are saying. So how do you tell that story that sort of connects witchcraft with what we know is the accusation of witchcraft, what we know the core problem? And the core problem, of course, is a misogyny, and ingrained misogyny in a patriarchal world. Despite, again, Europe achieving quite a lot in terms of women's rights, we still, by the core, are patriarchal societies, even in the Nordic countries that pride themselves on the achievements on gender equality. If you look at gender equality indices, all 4 Nordic countries usually are at the head of this indices, even 5 countries, of course, Iceland, include Iceland, and we sort of pride ourselves, and I live in Finland, pride ourselves on being at that point, and yet, if we talk about domestic violence, rape, other types of violence against women, and online harassment, and in Finland, we've experienced a lot of anti-misogyny, anti-women misogyny harassment online against our government. We have a female prime minister, and all the major parties are led by women. So that is the question that is pertaining to I think to our discussion, and that brings us back to femicide and to witch hunts, in a sense that women got killed and witches got prosecuted, and that's a lesson that we historically learn, mostly because of a great misogyny into these societies. There are other, of course, there's a plethora of other explanations why this misogyny exists and why it is still sort of reproduced and perpetuated. I like the Silvia Federici's, of course, idea on the sort of fight for resources, and sort of witchcraft has been a tool to remove the competition in this fight, and the capitalism basically been responsible for that. And yet, I think coming from an ex-Marxist ideology, as I was trained as a student, of course, in a deeply sort of Marxist scientific methodology, and yet I would like to think that this is not just about economics or capitalism or what we call the basis, that it's also a something more in a connection with the way the society chooses to continue to aspire to binaries, chooses to continue to reproduce stereotypes, gender division of labor, gender division, of course, build themselves on social stereotypes and reproduce the stereotypes because that is the way that they got used to do it, but also that's the way which is the easiest way rather than to stick to diversity, to inclusivity, to incorporate a variety of genders, sexual orientations, races, ethnicities, etc., etc. In a number of talks, and I think in Synnøve's talk, on behalf of the museum, the one way that what we can do as scholars and as teachers is one way to introduce educational programs and to talk to the younger generation and to the public about what we learn from femicides and from past femicides and from witchcraft, and that is why in Steilneset Museum and a monument is a great and admirable achievement that Finnmark and Norway has done, and Liv Helene's invested quite a lot of work as a researcher into this, and I've been thinking and looking at the webpage. Unfortunately, we're not there, that I hoped that we would be able to come. Looking at the webpage and looking at the types of projects and listening to Synnøve's presentation, I've been thinking that we need more initiatives like that, and that would be something that we can achieve as academics and as teachers and as sort of members of public institutions to continue to deconstruct stereotyping, to expose our past and to use our past and to work with memory politics, the way that we can bring attention to the core problem of society and introduce educational programs that allow us to change that, to change stereotypes, to give women agency, to build women's capacity in society, to build their self-assurance, to let them be who they are, to not tell women what to do. It's pretty easy. It starts from there. And at the same time, I've been thinking, what can we do as women, of course, because a lot of us, the majority of us who participate in this symposium or who presented are women. And as women, of course, that's inseparable for me, the woman and a scholar and academic, but still, as women, of course, we can also support other women. We can provide them with solidarity. We can believe that we are not following the lies of misogyny, we're not supporting patriarchy, we're not reproducing toxic masculinities, we're capable of going beyond the beyond violence and beyond hate to have that communication, because we've learned the hard way as women that you are targeted just because of who you are. And we need to remember that, especially in a contemporary situation. I hope that the roundtable that follows sort of my very brief reprisal of the symposium is going to have a lively discussion. I unfortunately won't have access to participate in that. But I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers that this symposium took place. It is extremely important, in my opinion, to be able to bring the problem of femicide and misogyny to our attention, to the public's attention again and again. Thank you.
Well, we're going to have a short round table. And we have already been given a question by Marianna, why is this still happening? And this actually feeds into a question that we have prepared, which is Christelle's keynote title was Why a Symposium on Femicide at Steilneset. As I say, Marianne has given us a summing up for today's presentation. Perhaps we could start now by asking each of you to what degree you feel the symposium has answered this question. Why a symposium on femicide at Steilneset? Christelle, maybe you'd like to start.
I think yes, in fact, because it's, of course, it's a complex question. If a place can embody all the reality, or the realities in plural, of the question of femicide versus feminicide. But I think we have a very, very important, different point of view about what were the witch hunts like mass feminicide in past, and what is the connection with the present at this time. And like I said in the introduction, I'm totally sure that the Steilneset Memorial has something like a bridge between history and actual society, but also, of course, between past and present. And of course, the objective of all of that is to build or to rebuild another world, a world much more equal, of course, but of course also inclusive, respectful. And so I think it's a good place to do that. It's a first step and a good place to do that.
Liv Helene, any comments?
I think Steilneset Memorial is a place where you have this openness and this very serious expression, and which shows clearly how women executed for witchcraft primarily were women, and thus is a parallel to much of what we see today. And I think what we have heard now, we have heard voices from women in different countries, and women in different positions and with different views when it comes to the liberation of women and the equal worth of women. And I think this, the voices we have heard today, they would, in a way, fill in this picture of all the different shades of violence against women and persecution of women with a deadly result. So I think the voices we have heard, the whole bouquet of voices we have heard today, is a signal that Steilneset Memorial could be a place to fathom many different opinions about witchcraft and women, but also about what is happening in today's world when it comes to violence. Because Steilneset has an expression that is much wider than history alone. It is much wider, and it is due to this dignity and this very, very strong place and strong memorial that Steilneset is. I think it can be a place where new thoughts, where redemption, where remorse, but also a place where hope could be at its right place and in its right environment, because all what we hear from the women who has had the voice today in this symposium, both for the past and the present, is that we all hope for a better and more equal status of women worldwide. This is what they all say. We hope there will be a change so that the equality between men and women, even in a patriarchal society, that it is possible to change and to make this situation better for women.
Synnøve, you've been along for the whole journey, really. You started work here in 2012, I believe, just after the opening, and much of what we've been talking about has come from ideas that you have developed. How do you feel about this question of Steilneset?
I'm sorry, I didn't know quite how I...
Steilneset as a place to, the question was why a symposium at Femicide at Steilneset? And given that you've been along on the whole journey, maybe you'd like to give some reflections about how you feel about that.
Well, I think it's a good ending of a long journey to show that we are able to actually have a symposium like this about femicide and to show the link between the past and the present. I was going to answer you quite in an activist way also. Why a symposium on femicide? We have a name for it and we shall shout it. And we need to talk about it and we need to repeat. And the more we repeat, at one point, I hope and think we will achieve what is our goal, and that's full equality for all human beings in this world.
So the origin of this symposium is your book, Christelle.
Yes, it is.
Femicide, a World History. It will be published later this year. A number of the participants today have written text for the book. So would you like to tell us a little bit about your intentions in starting the project and your feelings now as the book nears completion?
Yes, you know, it's a very, very, very big project. In fact, it was 3 years of my life and the life of many people in the world. So it's difficult to resume it very, very briefly. But in the short response, I think I have in my mind at the beginning of the project third very important intention. The first one is to produce an academic work of great quality, thanks to the contribution of the greatest specialists in the world, with two main aims. The first one is the chronological longevity, because the book is from prehistoric time to present. And I think it's very important to repeat that it's not a new history at all. It always be the history of humanity. And that's why I think the chronological longevity is very important to demonstrate that. And the second one is to have a very important geographical density, because if we want to build another world, it's necessary to build another history of humanity too. And it can be only our history. It can be only the history of Europe, of the Occident. It's necessary to replace all the continents in the global history of humanity. And that's why it's absolutely necessary to have this very important density, because the book speaks about the 5 continents. And I hope in the very equally demonstration. My second intention, and it's very important to I think that this was not enough to produce an academic work of great quality. It wasn't enough for me, because it was also necessary to hear all the voices that express themselves on this question. And I think it's very important to link, and we saw that it's very possible and very fruitful, the links between academic voices, political voices, journalistic voices, artistic voices. And it's necessary to hear all these voices in a very equally. It's necessary to, in fact, see all of them in a horizontal way, if I can say that in English. I don't know if it makes sense to speak about the question of horizontal way, but not to be in vertical way, because vertical is something hierarchical and very masculine, in fact. And so if you are in the horizontal way, you can build another demonstration. And I think it was absolutely necessary to do that. But I think all these voices, each one of them carries a certain part of the reality of feminicide. And that's why it's so important to hear all of them. And of course, it was very important for me to treat with respect and seriousness the words of the survivors and the silence of the dead. And I think it's very important in the memorial too. That's why the connection is absolutely normal and natural for me. And my third intention is in this purpose, clarify in fine that feminicide is not only an individual, intimate, and domestic crime, but feminicide speak about a very old continuum of violence against women that are exercised in all the fields of the life. And that's what I believe the book will clearly demonstrate. So, briefly, shortly, that is the purpose of the future book.
Your book is being published first in France, I believe, but will there be an English translation?
I hope so, but it's difficult. It's a rights problem, you know. It's very difficult to understand for me, but I hope so. Not only in English, in fact, but in all the languages wants to translate the book, of course. In Norwegian, why not?
Why not?
If it's possible.
Okay. Liv Helene, you've not only contributed to Femicide, a World History, Christelle's book, but you've written extensively about Steilneset, and you were also deeply involved in the creation of Steilneset Memorial, writing all the texts. How do you view the future role of Steilneset as a site for focusing on global activism, addressing femicide? Maybe the museum's role there as well?
Yes. I think Steilneset Memorial has a possible role in playing an active part in this fight against feminicide. And this is, as I see it, something that reaches far more than Norway in itself. I think Steilneset Memorial has this capacity, and that is because of its quality as a piece of art. It is because of the documentation of feminicide. It is because of the whole inviting position it has taken for visitors to come there. And this dignity and respect it has been disseminated with. This is the reason why I think Steilneset Memorial really could play a part in a larger international context. And I have got responses from visitors to Steilneset coming from most continents of the world. And what they say is that they are touched, they are moved when they meet Steilneset and the experience they have there. But they say something else that is very important, because they say that Steilneset Memorial is different from other places in the world where witchcraft trials have memorial or monuments. And this is because Steilneset Memorial has been disseminated in a way and presented in a way that is clear of this idea that you should sell it to highest bidding offer. And I think this is very important because Steilneset, just by the way, and particularly by the way it has been presented by Vardø Museum, Synnøve Fotland Eikevik, and also by Marianna Muravyeva, it has been presented as a place where people should remember that when they come there to commemorate dead people and people who are killed. And they do not come there for entertainment. And I think this way it has been now during the 10 years since Steilneset was opened, the way it has been presented and the way the world and the visitors see Steilneset whenever they come there and wherever they come from, this is the point that I would say Steilneset Memorial could produce new thoughts, could produce very, very much more attention to the fact of femicide, and it could produce even thoughts and possibilities for working ahead. And I think this is something Steilneset Memorial, and we have seen today during this symposium how Steilneset Memorial can link not only past and present, but also can link the local history of Vardø to historical events, other places in the world, because it is centering on the same axis. So I think Steilneset has a possibility, really, in a proper way, and not in a speculative way, to build something in our hope and in our achievement to have a world where women and men are accepted and can live together as equal beings.
This leads me on to another question, and finally, the last question, really. One of the goals of the Steilneset Symposium was to address the need for continued global activism against femicide in contemporary society, thereby ensuring an equitable future, as you mentioned, for all. So we've heard a couple of comments right at the beginning this morning. The French ambassador suggested that there was a possibility of continuing cooperation around Steilneset and femicide, and Marianna too was very complimentary about the role of museums. So how do each of you view the future role of Steilneset as a site for focusing on global activism addressing femicide? Maybe you'd like to start?
Okay, I want to say before we respond of the question that I totally agree with Liv Helene, because I think you do not visit at all Steilneset. You meet Steilneset. And it's a very, very important difference. You go to the museum to see something like in the Louvre, for example, but you can do, of course, the same. You can do the same thing when you are in this place. Really, it's a very special experience, and I think it's something very close of all the persecution area in the world, and you are this very, very terrible feeling when you are inside, really. So this very singular space can be, of course, the rendezvous in French, le rendezvous régulier of, I think, I don't know, a place of meeting, discussion, sharing, and reflection about feminicide. And I think it can be possible to have a regular rendezvous here to speak about that. I don't know how many persons, I don't know how can it possible, but I think it will be a very symbolic demonstration of the reality of the history, the possibility of change it for the future, and to realize that sorority and fraternity can be real somewhere. And this place is a good place to exemplify that.
Synnøve.
Yes, I would also say that I hope this is just the beginning and not the ending of what we have done today. And also for the future, that Steilneset Memorial will also be an arena exactly where we meet, where we talk about things with the local community, not only external, but also in the local community, because that's where change starts. It starts close, and then it spreads like rings in water. And I hope that this symposium today has been the first ring that will continue.
And I suppose maybe you'd like to say a little bit about the women's network here, who are also a part of the program here.
Yeah, we are having a very good cooperation with the Women's Network, a small group of women from different places and political parties in Vardø, and they have been very active in helping the museum, so to the degree that this day has been passed over for them to arrange with a little help from us. And as a museum professional, I would say that's mission completed in cooperating with the local community.
That sounds great. And Liv Helene, I don't know if you have any thoughts, final thoughts?
Yes, I would like to say that I think this is a good beginning of a type of meetings or a type of arrangements where we could follow what we have heard from the voices today. And we have heard that it is a question both of the individual person and violence in close connections, in families, on an individual level. And we have also heard about violence against women and femicide as a part of a bigger structure, that the structure should be changed in a way to allow more equal parts of men and women in society. So I think it is very important to keep on with this connection between the singular, the individual member of a society, of a local society, and these ideas, what is more an overview of what society and a structure of a society ideally could be to help a better and more democratic world.
Well, I think that's a very good way of concluding our symposium, and I'd like, on behalf of Varanger Museum, to say thank you to all our speakers and to all those who came and visited us in Vardø Culture House, and all those people out on the net as well, of course. And hopefully we'll see you again maybe next year.
Thank you.